Hello everybody, welcome to another episode of Diederik's Beach Bar. This is another Dinosaur Rock Guitar episode, which I'm very excited about. We're going to do a deep dive into Tony Iommi, who's best known for being the guitar player of Black Sabbath. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, here's Dinosaur Dave of Dinosaur Rock Guitar, who's going to teach us a lot about Tony Iommi, the guitar legend. Enjoy, ladies and gentlemen. This is a good one. All right, man. Here we are again.
Yes, I'm going from one giant to another here.
I'm excited, man.
Yeah, the big daddies of this style of music, where Blackmore was one of them. Tony Iommi is also of that stature, perhaps even a bigger stature, if you realize that for all intents and purposes, he invented metal. There is some discussion out there about who really invented heavy metal, and there's some people out there who have the mindset that, it came out of, things like the Yardbirds and Cream were proto-metal, and then there was a band called Blue Cheer, which a lot of people think should be in the conversation about who invented heavy metal. But Sabbath is generally accepted as the really inventors of metal, and it's beyond just power and volume of the music. It's also the construction of the music, the harmonic content of the kinds of things that were being played that were starting to deviate away from blues-based formulas and going more into minor scales and using the flatted fifth interval, which is, they used to call that the devil's note in music. And that comes from Tony Iommi and Black Sabbath in modern rock and metal. Obviously, classical composers were doing this a long time ago. But for the few people who say Blue Cheer might be credited as the founders of metal, their music was still very, while loud as could be, was still very blues based. Whereas Sabbath, you're starting to get into these different harmonic ideas and these different scales. And again, the other thing is the riffiness of it. Tony Iommi, aside from being the father or the godfather of metal, whatever you want to call him, is also probably the greatest riff king of all time. In terms of, again, you're talking modern music. So he's a guy who was an endless supply of heavy riffs and great riffs, and people who came later, like Metallica, would take very similar kinds of ideas and speed them up and things like that. But there's this old sort of joke among hard rock and heavy metal fans that every metal riff you ever heard, Tony Iommi probably already played it, and maybe Metallica heard it and just sped it up, and you get a different song when you do that or something like that. But anyway, that's the folklore. But I think you can definitely make the case that most heavy metal music as it exists today can be traced back to Black Sabbath now as the real progenitor of that style of music.
Well, as I prepared for this podcast, I listened to pretty much everything he ever put out, and once I was into it a little bit, I was like, man, there's just so much of it. There's such an endless amount of riffs, and they're all just really good.
Yeah. There wasn't a lot of down period. I mean, there was some down period where they were all everybody in the band was taking too many drugs and the music was suffering, but that happened after an incredible amount of good music came out, and then after they sort of cleaned up, another great amount of great music came out of Tony, and he is again, like Blackmore, a true original. He's a guy, he has some influences that he lists. He's talked about loving Wes Montgomery and Les Paul and Eric Clapton. And, sure, you can say that those are, if he says that, I trust them, but I don't hear it so much in his playing. Right. When I hear him play, he's one of those guys who's instantly recognizable as his own unique thing. He's one of those guys, like when you hear a Van Halen or a Blackmore or a Jimmy Page, you instantly know who it is. And part of that is his riff work, but part of that is also his lead style and his sound and all of those things that comprise a player's originality and their own distinctiveness. There's a lot of people who've taken an awful lot from Black Sabbath, and none of them sound like Tony. You could get into the idea that like this whole genre of doom metal, with bands like The Sword and things like those guys, almost all of that stuff comes out of being influenced by Sabbath, and specifically like Master of Reality level era Sabbath. I mean, Master of Reality, that album, which is Sabbath's third album, launched a whole musical genre of a sound that people are still chasing to this day. And say what you will about how influential and enduring Led Zeppelin is, and how influential Deep Purple was, even though they were less enduring than Led Zeppelin. When you think about it, Black Sabbath's music sounds in many ways less dated than what you would get from Led Zeppelin or Deep Purple. There are bands now that still strive to sound like Black Sabbath, young bands, and in genres of metal and things like that, who still, like I say, they take their cues from Sabbath. And I think the thing with that is that this music, this kind of music, this angry, riffy rock with, dark, melodic characteristics still speaks to teenage angst in a way that, teenage angst is enduring. That's timeless, right? Right. And people will still get that visceral effect off of music like this, whereas maybe they don't get it so much from Robert Plant singing trippy things like Going to California. It doesn't seem as today, right, as something like Sweet Leaf, for example, right, where it's sort of timeless. If you came down from Mars and you heard what was going on musically now in rock, and I'm not talking about in pop and and things like that, Black Sabbath would sound less out of place, I think, than the other bands of that era. The other great bands of that era, taking nothing away from them, but just saying, there's something about their music that remains valid in 2020, 2021, whereas some of the other classic rock sounds more dated.
Right. Well, the only thing that would give it away would be the recording quality and technology that they had at the time. Because when I put on the Reunion live album, and heard those old songs from the 70s recorded from 1999 with modern microphones, modern everything, it made me realize how huge those songs sound, really. And right. It already sounds big on the original recording, but if you hear it in that context, you realize like, oh my God, that's just
But some of the other things we're going to listen to, I think I found some isolated guitar tracks from, I believe it's from Master of Reality.
Cool.
Which is 1971. And if you listen to isolated guitar tracks of Tony Iommi from 1971, which we'll do in a little bit, my God, they sound huge. They sound absolutely devastating in a way that, like, young kids would kill to have that sound. And he was getting that sound in 1971 when a lot of people were not getting that sound. And by that, I mean Page and Blackmore were not getting that sound. Other heavy rock players were not getting quite that kind of sound in that era. Not that they were getting bad sounds, but I mean, in terms of like it still stands up, and it still stands up as like an epically big, modern sounding heavy guitar tone.
Yeah. I meant more like the overall sound. The drums usually
Oh,
sound
sure.
kind of thin, but I agree
Sure.
that the guitar is huge.
Yeah. So, you know, like I said, we talked a little bit about his influences, and his influences were one of the factors in what shaped him as a player. The other thing I think that most fans know by now, but people who are not fans wouldn't necessarily know this, is that Tony had an accident right before Sabbath was really getting started, where he lost the fingertips of his fretting hand on two of his fingers. And we have a clip of Tony explaining that in, you know, his own words, and here it is. All right, so in addition to being, you know, truly motivated to carry on and still be a player, and I believe, you know, from that point on, he started listening to a little bit of Django Reinhardt, who also had an injury to his hand, which inspired Tony that he could still keep going and not have to never play guitar again. One of the things that he did was he started using the lightest strings he could find, and back in those days, it was hard to, you know, there were not all the custom gauges that you can buy now. So he figured out how to make his own custom light strings, and so that when he would bend his strings, they would be easier to bend with fingertips that were artificial and things like that. All of these, he would tune down. He was one of the first guys who was tuning down to E flat or C sharp to not only create, you know, a doomier sound, but it was out of necessity because it helped him play on looser strings where he had a little more control because he had this injury.
They did that first on Master of Reality, right?
No. I think I don't know where he was doing that as soon as possible. He was a guitar design innovator as well. We'll get into that a little bit with the gear, but I'm just saying in terms of like the factors that shaped his playing style and his tone, these were all among those things. The fact that he had this accident and it forced him to play in a little bit of a different way than other people did, forced him to make some choices that other people weren't making. It's a lot of ingenuity, really.
Okay.
But the other side of it was, you know, going in this heavy direction where the music started to sound, you know, dark and doomy as opposed to bluesy.
Right.
And part of that came from when they were, before they were called Black Sabbath, they were a rhythm and blues band called Earth. And they would play the same kind of things Cream would play, really. They'd play, you know, amped up bluesy rock and things like that. There's two songs on the first Sabbath album that you can hear this early band before they became, you know, doomy and dark. So we can just say there's a couple of tracks on Sabbath 1 that you're hearing the leftovers of their bluesy days. It's sort of mixed in with the doomy stuff.
Yeah.
But the truth is, everything changes when they go to a horror movie one night. And then the next morning in rehearsal, they're talking about the movie. And Geezer says, isn't it interesting that people will go to a movie just to get scared and to be, you know, to have, you know, a scary experience. And they started talking about wouldn't it be cool if we wrote scary sounding music? And from there, you get the song that would become Black Sabbath and the riff that to this day is one of the greatest riffs he ever wrote. And it's sort of stolen from the classical composer Holst from the piece called The Planets. And it's the first time you hear the flatted fifth interval where, you know, it goes da, and that third note is the flatted fifth interval. And, you know, this song is, you know, they called it Black Sabbath, then they named the band Black Sabbath, and they what they had done is they had found their direction without necessarily consciously being aware of it in the moment, but they came up with that, and that turned out to be the guiding direction, and that turned out to be the game changer. And really, the first time you hear this kind of powerful, very loud, amplified music played with that kind of a mood and that kind of a harmonic structure, like I said, you'll find it in classical music. But I mean, this flatted fifth interval thing was a big deal in Europe. The church had banned it for centuries. You can't use that note in music. It's the devil's note.
Really?
Right? Yeah. It's called, I think, Diabla Musica or something like that. And
wow. So.
But by the time they were using it, it wasn't illegal by the church's standard anymore to use it, but no one was doing it. Everything prior to this was blues-based.
And was it a
right?
conscious thing? Like, did he know what he was doing when he did it?
Yeah, they were trying to make it sound scary, like the Scary Movie they had seen.
Huh.
So they were trying to create this dramatic effect, and I think he had heard Holt's the Planet, so he understood that. And by the way, that same progression where you have root, octave, flatted fifth, that's you hear that in one of the Zeppelin songs too, on Zeppelin 3. Is it Friends on Zeppelin 3? He used it too. It's a piece of it. It's the first phrase.
Okay.
So here's root, octave, fifth, flat five. Yeah, now pull up Holt's the Planets. So it wasn't, historically it wasn't new to use this note, but certainly in a post-Beatles world, it was new. And to use it amped up like that, and to attach a really dark, gloomy story to the thing, and then the whole album opens, the first Sabbath album opens with, the sound of rain and a tolling church bell before this comes in. I mean, I know guys who are older than me who remember the day they brought that album home, the day it was released, because they'd never heard it before, and they put that needle down on the first track, and they were like, "Whoa, what the hell is this?" This was like nothing anyone had ever heard in, post Beatles popular music. So this is where it starts, and from there, you branch out on this album into other songs that also have sort of these darker, less bluesy constructs. And Tony just started writing riffs, and he found out that he seemed to be an endless fountain of great guitar riffs. And there are some guys like that. I mean, I interviewed Wolf Hoffman one time, the guitarist from Accept, who is another great riff guy. And one of the things I asked him was like, where do the riffs come from? I said, "You've written so many unbelievable riffs." And he's like, "I don't know, man." He said, if I have any one strength, he said, it's that I can cough up 5 great riffs in an hour. And, it's just one of those things that it's a skill you either have or you don't have it. And guys like Iommi had it, guys like Wolf Hoffman had it, and guys like Joe Bonamassa don't have it. And, there are guys who just really excel at writing great riffs. And when we're talking about, the big three of heavy rock and heavy metal, it's Tony, it's Ritchie Blackmore, it's Jimmy Page. They all have this ability to come up with great riffs. And, Tony's probably done more than everybody. His body of work is much larger too, by the way.
Yeah, he just never stopped.
Right. So he's got a much larger body of work, and it's very consistent. And we talk about guys who've lost some ability over time, and Jimmy Page is one of them. He is nowhere near the player now, or the last time we heard from him, that he was in the 70s. He's lost a lot of his ability. And Blackmore doesn't choose to play that style of music anymore. And we talked about guys who, somehow lose something over time. And some guys like Slash, they improve over time. Tony's a guy who's been remarkably consistent over time. He hasn't lost any of his ability. He hasn't. I wouldn't say he's a guy who's grown a lot either, but he has been remarkably consistent in what he delivers over the course of the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, and into the modern decade. But his thing is he does the things that he's known for, and he does them over and over again, and he does them really well.
I would make the argument by the time Dio comes around, I find that his solo style, it seems like faster and a little bit more, It's There's also a wah pedal, like he seems to be a better player, like more, it seems smoother around that time.
I think you could say maybe he's because he's been out on the road for all this time. He's playing constantly. Yeah, there's probably a noticeable facility where he's maybe got a little more facility and flexibility. But to me, it doesn't change how he plays so much. I mean, it still sounds like him. It still sounds similar to what he was coming up with earlier. There's some times where he's busier than others, I guess is the best way to put it. As a lead player, he's busier. But, he's not a guy who progressed into doing, sweep picking and tapping and all of those things that became, different levels of guitar style that he lived through, but he wasn't of that generation. He stayed within his own space, if you will, and became better within that space.
Right. Yeah.
But if you watch what happened with for example, the guys in Judas Priest, Glenn and KK, they tried to keep up with whatever the trend of the day was in the 80s. And by the 90s, you get into songs like Painkiller, and they're doing sweep picking and stuff like that. And they're doing sweeped arpeggios and all of this stuff that was, sort of its time. They were trying to be of their time. And, for better or worse, they did those things, of that way, of that nature. And it's in their recorded music. Tony didn't follow trends, is, I guess, the best way to put it that way. Tony just did what Tony does. And sometimes he did it, I guess, like with a little bit more facility, I guess you could say, in the lead work. But it's still stylistically, the things he's doing in his lead work are some of the same stuff he was doing earlier on, I guess. If that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. So he's really the same guy. He's kicking out the same moody, plotting dinosaur riffs and tasty solos. His direction remained the same. He still wants to kick ass when he picks up a guitar. He hasn't gone off and done a blues album. He hasn't gone off and done an acoustic album. He's been really true to the direction that he found. Once he found it. By the way, he had a cup of coffee with Jethro Tull. Before Sabbath actually got signed and became big, he got an opportunity to join Jethro Tull, and he took it, and he was there for about maybe a month, and before he realized he didn't want to be in that band, and he went back to Sabbath. However, that 1 month that he was with them, or whatever it was, he was filmed in the Rolling Stones Rock and Roll Circus playing live with Jethro Tull. So there is sort of like this little footnote in history. If you go watch the Rock and Roll Circus, and when Tull comes on, there's Tony Iommi looking very un-Iommi-like in a band where he's not wearing black, and he's not all the things he's known for, with almost always wearing black and black leather and cross around his neck and all of that stuff that he has been pretty consistent with. He looked very different in Jethro Tull but he wasn't ever comfortable there, and he went back and resumed his career in Black Sabbath. Thank goodness he did. The world would have been a very different place if he had stayed in Jethro Tull, I think. All right. So we've talked about the riffs, and we've talked about the consistency. The other thing about the consistency is he's another one of these guys that if you go see Tony live, he will almost never miss a note. I don't think I've ever seen him miss a note in a live concert. He's just like, whether it's a lead or a solo. I'm sure he does, but I mean, for all of the live footage I've ever seen of Black Sabbath, he's just like Mr. Consistency. He hits all his notes. He hits all his solos right on the money. He's a guy who's just really consistently professional in that respect. He's not like going to be adventurous in the middle of a solo. He's not taking it in new directions. He's going to play the solo that he played on the album, and he's going to play it right, and he's going to get it right, and he's not going to mess it up.
Was it also the case when they were all just completely cranked on cocaine?
There is some footage of that, and like I said, I'm not going to say that, I don't have, access to every performance he ever played. But for the most part, when you see live footage of him, he's right on the nuggets. I mean, it doesn't matter what era you're talking about, whether it's, the Paris in '69 or, the Midnight Special in the mid '70s or wherever it is you're looking at. Even when they're like being blown off the stage in '78 by Van Halen, even in that era when, the band was on its last legs and in the original lineup, Tony was still hitting every note on the video footage I've seen. So, I think, that's a testament to also how good he is. And especially if he was, doing a lot of drugs at that time, the fact that he could get on stage and deliver a consistent performance every night, I think is, speaks a lot to his ability as a musician. The other thing that makes Tony Tony, and one of his strengths, is his rhythm playing and his meter. Beyond the riffs that he's written, the way he plays them, how he plays his rhythms. One of his greatest strengths is his ability to lay back in the track and lay back on the beat. He never rushes. He never rushes ahead of the beat. He usually drags and plays behind the beat, the same way John Bonham played drums in Zeppelin. Doing this creates tension and heaviness in music, whether you're talking about Iommi or John Bonham. The reason they both sounded so heavy is they don't play right on the one, which a musician will know what that means, but we can show you what this means in a demonstration, because there's two clips of the same song, one with Tony playing it and one with Glenn Hughes' guitar player playing it. And the one with Tony, he's playing behind the beat. And the one with Glenn Hughes' guitar player, he's playing it right on the beat. And you'll hear the difference. One sounds really heavy and the other one sounds good, but it just doesn't have that big stomping sound that you get when you lay back on the beat.
Different guitar sound too.
Yeah, but you expect a different guitar sound, but it's really in the feel that I'm talking about. This is how the feel can change the whole way a track is perceived, right? Just by this little thing of not playing right on the beat and letting it drag changes everything. The other time you'll hear it is when you hear Ozzy's guitarists play Sabbath songs, for example. When you go and listen to how Randy Rhoads played Paranoid versus, how, or Iron Man versus how Tony plays it. And Randy's right on the beat. And Tony's still doing this thing where he drags behind the beat. And, you might prefer one over the other, but, this is the difference in why Tony sounds like Tony. This is, a huge part of why he sounds as heavy as he does. And it's his sense of meter and his sense of rhythm playing. So those are mainly his strengths. And usually we will talk about a player's weaknesses again. And with Tony, there's not much in the way of weakness. And the thing that usually comes up is that we talk about the riffs, we talk about the rhythm work, and you can talk for days about Tony Iommi without ever getting around to talking about his lead guitar playing. And it's not really that it's a weakness. It's just overshadowed by this monstrous thing he's created with riffs and rhythm. And the truth is, he's a really tasty melodic soloist who plays really great leads. But as strong as they are, they tend to be overshadowed by his riff playing and his rhythm work.
What are some of your personal favorite solos he plays?
I like the kinds of things where he does create melodies. Like, for example, in Snowblind, he's not playing particularly demanding stuff. It's a very simple solo, but he's creating like a melodic theme that he goes with. And then, you know, he's not what you would call an 80s style player in his lead work. He's very much a 70s stylist. And he's known for certain kinds of characteristics that we'll talk about in his guitar style. But he's doing, you know, a lot of very basic things. But, you know, he will play fast. He will play slow. He'll contrast fast and slow. He'll do tempo changes and things where, you know, for example, in Heaven and Hell, you know, there's parts where he'll do some slow, bendy, melodic stuff, and then tempo changes, and he'll go into, you know, a faster type of solo or something like that. So there's a lot of dynamic contrast, mostly between slow and fast, not so much between loud and soft. There's not a whole lot of soft in Black Sabbath's catalog. You might get, you know, you do get sometimes the quieter intro to a song that then gets heavy. Or, you know, there are the occasional quiet songs, but it's very occasional. And it's not like, for example, with Zeppelin, where, you know, there's a zillion songs that are acoustic and electric. You know, that's not so much where they get their dynamic contrast. It's a lot of it is from going from slow to fast. And the other thing, none of this is a weakness, by the way. So, but I don't think the majority of people who think of Tony Iommi think of him as a lead guitar player, even though he's a great one. So I think it's just a matter of it being overshadowed by the other things he does even better. So if there's any weakness, it's that he's sort of overshadowed himself. So let's move on to talking about his tone. He's another guy who has created an enormous rhythm tone that if you ever get to see Tony live, it's increasingly unlikely that you will, but if you've ever seen him live, you'll realize his guitar tone, it really hits you right in the sternum. His tone is so thick and heavy that if you're in the building with him playing in a concert, it's just like thumping you in the chest. And it's supported a lot by the bass, which is usually doing the same riff at the same time. So it gives us this massive sort of feel. But it's a really heavy tone, and it has been since day one. And he uses SG guitars primarily, certainly live.
Gibson
almost all
SG,
of his
right?
well, he uses Gibson SGs, he uses JD SGs, and I think that's probably it. But his original SG, he had two guitars, and the story was that he had a Strat and he had an SG, and he got the SG as a backup. And when he was getting ready to record the first album, and this was an SG, by the way, with the P90s in it, rather than humbuckers.
Okay.
And the story was when he went to record the first Black Sabbath album, something went wrong with the Strat's electronics, and he couldn't get them working in the studio, or it was noisy, or it was cutting out, or whatever. And it was the first time he really picked up the SG in earnest and used it. And, you know, again, you talk about a happy accident. What would the first Sabbath sound like with a Strat instead of an SG, and things that could have happened in music, right? And, you know, he created this sound that I think was probably way heavier and way nastier than anything that would have come out of his Strat.
And did he use the same guitar for all the recordings, or for the albums that followed? Or
once he settled on the SG, he ended up going into some experimentation and having a guy named JD build him. So there's a luthier in the UK named John Diggins, and he made Tony Iommi's famous, what's a beat up looking brown SG, which is a custom SG made for Tony. It was the first one with the cross inlays, I believe. And Tony Iommi was also an innovator in that he was the first guy who wanted 24 frets.
Okay.
And he ended up getting 24 his original SG was mostly a stock SG of the time. I think it was a 63, and it had normal 22 frets on the Gibson, and I think it had, like I said, the P90s. He had this guy John Diggins build him a SG that had 24 frets, humbuckers, and cross inlays on all the position markers. And that guitar, I think they call that the old boy now. That's his number one guitar. He used that for years. It's beat to crap. It looks like it's been through a fire, but that was, a big part of what he used for a lot of the time. And then he did also use Gibson SGs later, and then much later, Gibson put out a Tony Iommi SG signature SG. I had one at one time, and it had 24 frets. It had the silver inlays. It had his custom signature Gibson pickups. The pickups were fantastic. They were noiseless. They were noiseless humbuckers. They had a ton of output. They were really good sounding. And I had a friend who had a Laney half stack, and when I plugged that guitar into the Laney half stack, it is absolutely the sound you heard on The Last Supper. That exact sound with his signature pickups coming out of an amp that's pretty much what his amp was for many, many years. We haven't gotten into the amp stuff yet, but so it's always been SGs on stage, and usually, like I said, it would be either Gibson or this JD thing he had. Sometimes they were signature ones. Gibson recently put out a recreation of the original 63 one that he had acquired at the time. He still had the Strat. And they wanted some stupid amount of money for it, like $25,000 or something like that. It's nuts. God. Yeah, it's just insane that they think that they can get that for that kind of guitar. But they put out a recreation of it because they've done that for a lot of people. But so he used those things mostly on stage. He also used them for recording, but he would also I know he was using on occasion Les Pauls for recording to thicken up the sound. He would pull out a Les Paul and thicken up the sound with it. But mostly his sound is the sound of an SG with very light strings on it, like eights. And you can hear that in his piercing lead tone. There's a lot of treble in his lead tone. It's a very piercing, bright sounding lead tone. He's always been a guy who used EL34 amps, and for the most part, I'd say 90% of it was Laney amps. And that's another huge differentiator for Tony Iommi and a lot of other people. Where everybody else was mostly using Marshalls, Tony, from very early on, you even see it in the clips from Paris in 1969, he's using Laney stacks. So Laney was another British guitar amp maker who were doing their take on an EL34 based 100-watt amp, and they called it the Super Group. It was similar in design to a Marshall Plexi, but slightly voiced differently. It has a different character to it, and for whatever reason, whether it was through chance or through relationship building, Tony Iommi started early on using Laney amplifiers. And largely stuck with them. There was a time he switched back to Marshalls for a while. He used some Marshalls, but he then went back to Laney's again. And in the 70s, it was they called it a Laney Supergroup head, and he would use those. And I think there was also one called a Clip. And there is a good video that we have, a clip of Rick Beato showing how he got his early sound through his SG, through a Laney amp, using a treble booster also. Again, this is like, in those days, the amps didn't have separate gain stages, so they tried to push them a little harder from the front end, either with some kind of a fuzz pedal or something like that. And like I said, guys like Hendrix and Jimmy Page were using fuzz. Guys like Tony Iommi and Brian May were using treble boosters. But the idea was to just get a little more gain out of the amp from the front end before these amps had multiple gain stages. And there's this great clip that we're going to run now of Rick Beato showing how you do this and what it sounded like. And then years later, after he had gone back to Marshall for a while, he went back to Laney, and eventually he decided to have Laney build him a custom amp made to his own specifications. And he's been using those, I think, ever since. And I think it's called the TI 1000 or something like that. It's a Tony Iommi signature Laney amp.
TI 100.
Yeah. It's a 100 watt amp with his, preamp sound dialed in and the kinds of controls on it he likes to use. The other part of his tone that was pretty characteristic is he uses a lot of wah on his leads. Sometimes he uses it on his rhythms too, but a lot of wah on the leads, and he got that using an old wah pedal called the Tycho Brahe Para pedal. Those things are impossible to find. If you're going to be in a Sabbath cover band, you don't need to find one. You can get away with any wah. But that's what he was using in those days, and I think he has a bunch of them, so he still uses them. But it's sort of a relic from the 70s, and I'm sure it colors his lead tone in a distinctive way. But it's not something that your average listener is going to pick up on and say, "Oh, that's the Tycho Brahe wah," as opposed to the Vox wah or some modern wah or something like that. But it was part of his sound. And like I said, his lead tone is really bright. It's kind of thin and very piercing. So he was getting that from all of those things: the SG, through the Laney, through the treble booster, and through the wah.
But his rhythm sound is very heavy at the same time. So
right, it's not as bright, it's not as piercing, but it's got plenty of brightness to it. But it's got the low end too. It's got the beefy quality to it. And it's funny, his signature pickups that you can still buy. Gibson makes his signature pickups. They really, if you throw those into any SG, I had the signature SG, and it was It did that sound, but you could throw those signature pickups instead of buying the signature SG. You could get the pickups and throw them into any SG, and it'll give you that sound.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah, it's really
saves you $24,000.
Well, yeah. Well, I mean, there's that, but I mean, the one I had wasn't like that. The one I had was the '90s version of his signature guitar, and at the time, it was the most expensive SG that they made. And it was a custom shop SG, but I knew at the time when I was playing, and it's like you could throw these pickups in any SG, it would sound the same thing, right? Because everything else was cosmetic about it, really.
But that's what we talked about in the gear episode a while back.
Yeah. So I mean, the only really difference was that his SG had 24 frets, and you're paying for the aesthetics of having sterling silver cross inlays.
But if
or whatever it was, Epiphone made one that was cheap. You could put the signature pickups in the Epiphone Iommi, and it would sound just as good. I think they did put those pickups in the Epiphone Iommi, and you wouldn't hear any difference.
Okay. One question about the 24 fret. If you have 24 instead of 22, is the neck actually longer? Does the scale of the neck change, or do you just
the fingerboard just extends a little further.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was just curious about that because I know that if the scale changes, that also affects sound in all kinds of ways. So.
Right. No, it's still the Gibson scale, and I think the JD is, as far as I know, is also the Gibson scale.
Okay.
But he was doing things that later became very commonplace with guitar design, like other companies started putting out 24 fret guitars. Other string makers started putting out strings with 8s, and he, as I said, he was using that kind of thing because heavier strings would tear up his fingers, and it was out of necessity. But when we start talking about his guitar style, we're talking about the things that make him sound like him. This is what comes into play, having, light strings and tuning down, and to make his sound heavy and ballsy. And his goal was always to make Sabbath sound as heavy and as full as possible. And to that end, he was using techniques like palm muting and down picking and some other techniques he devised to make how he voices his chords. For example, he plays most of his power chords on the low E and A strings.
And can you also explain what down picking and palm muting is for those who don't know?
Yeah. So when you pluck guitar strings with a pick or a plectrum, you can go down, you can go up, or you can go down and up. And there is a chunkiness you get to using just downstrokes. And that's part of, the characteristic, punk is notorious for that. Thrash metal was notorious for that. And then if you get part of your hand onto the strings so that the strings don't ring perfectly, you get this muted effect. It's called palm muting because you're muting the strings with the palm of your hand, and you get this chunk, 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 chunk thing that you wouldn't get if you just let the strings ring on their own. So, but the other thing is he will almost always voice his chords on the low E string, where other people might voice them on the A string. There becomes a point on the guitar neck when you're going up to, say, play the octave of E, which is at the 12th fret of a guitar, where most rhythm players won't play the rhythm at the 12th fret on the low E string. They will switch over to the next string, the A string, and they'll play the E at the 7th fret. Part of this is because it's less cramped because as you go up the neck, the frets get smaller. But the other part of it is it's just in some ways more expedient to not go all the way up the neck to do that. And also, if you happen to be on a guitar like a Les Paul, it gets very difficult to start playing rhythm kinds of things at the 10 and 12th fret.
Yeah, because you only have one cutaway.
Right. And so things start getting jumbled and cramped up there. However, this is why if you have an SG has a lot of access to the high end of the neck. And so for Tony, this is one of the reasons I think why he liked the SG so much, is because you can play those chords up there in the D and E positions at 10 and 12 for things like War Pigs, for example, and you can stay on the low E string. And what he wanted to do was stay on that low E string because it's a thicker string and you get more oomph out of it, you get more balls out of it, you get more chunk out of it sonically. And so he would always voice his chords that way, and he was able to do that because he was on the SG. And it's funny because when I got my Tony Iommi SG, I started obviously playing a lot of Black Sabbath songs with it to see what it sounded like. And it was really interesting because when you do it on an SG, it's not uncomfortable playing it up there. But if you're playing it on a Strat or a Les Paul or some other guitar, it's not very comfortable playing it up in those positions. But on an SG, it works perfectly well because that guitar feels like it's all neck.
Interesting.
So I think we have a clip of Tony showing how he voices his chords and what he likes to do to make things thicker. And he explains it very well, what he does, and you get a good example. He plays it. And I think he's playing War Pigs, and he's showing you that he's, instead of playing it where most guitarists would play it from, D to E on the A string, he's playing it from D to E on the low E, which means he's playing it at the 10th and 12th fret. And, as heavy as that sounds, it's not intuitive that you would think it would sound that heavy when you're that high up the neck. You'd think it would sound, higher up the neck would be lighter, right? But the way he's doing it and the things he's doing to make those chords sound fatter, including sometimes adding vibrato to his chords, this is what created his style. This is what made his style so distinctive. These are the things that made him sound so heavy compared to other players. And these little things he figured out made him him. And you can run that clip.
Yeah, it's so good.
So, you have to think, if the man had been a Les Paul player, he wouldn't have been doing that. He would have never chosen to voice those chords if he had been a Les Paul guy. He would have never voiced them on the neck that high up.
Yeah, your hand would just hit the bass of the guitar. Like you wouldn't be
Yeah.
able to
Yeah,
get
it would
there.
have never happened.
Yeah.
But because he was using the SG, he figured that out. And there's a quote here from the Alchemy profile on the site. It says, "It definitely sounds darker and gloomier on the E and A strings, which is the vibe I was after. You get more of the chunk when you're playing it on the lower strings. He also likes to let the low E string note ring out whenever possible." You saw that in the clip. Chugging it, also doubling with the E at the 7th fret on the A string. He'll also double the open low E string and add vibrato on the E note on the A string to add a bit of a chorus effect. So all of these things were designed to make more sound, to make it fuller sound, where he's the only guitarist in the band. And of course, Geezer's usually fattening things up with him. Very rarely is Geezer not with him on the bass. They're usually playing the same riff in unison. So that's a huge part of the Sabbath sound. The way he voices chords, the way he's got his guitar rig set up to give you the definition that he wants and cut through, but also give all of this low end and crunch, and being reinforced by the bass.
Yeah, the bass is also a big part of the Sabbath sound.
Right.
It's such a big, heavy sound when they play the same thing in unison. It really works.
Yeah, it really does. And Geezer's sound also often had a lot of distortion associated with it as well. So you're getting, this massive wall of sound from coming off them. And he had a very growly, gnarly bass tone for most of the time. I mean, Geezer, also flirted around with different basses and different, rigs and things like that. But I think you can say, for the most part, it was always, a fairly gnarly, fuzzy bass sound that, and I don't mean fuzzy in the bad way. I mean fuzzy in a really righteously good way.
Overdriven bass. Yeah.
Overdriven in a way that sort of just growls at you in a way that's very satisfying.
Yeah.
As opposed to straight into the desk clean,
Were they also the first to do that, or one of the first to do that?
They must have been one of the first to do that. There are stories about when Cream went into Atlantic Records and were one of the first bands to really play loud in the studio. Because in those days, in the mid '60s, the studio engineers would tell you, "You can't play that loud. You can't. You're getting distortion. You're getting distortion. Oh my God, you're getting distortion." And the bands were like, "Yes, we're getting distortion. We've worked very hard to get distortion. We want distortion." And there's stories on the internet where Tom Allom, who was it's not Tom Allom, who's the guy? I can't remember anybody's name anymore.
Producer of the first album.
The producer of Cream.
Cream. Okay.
Tom Dowd. Yeah, all right.
Tom Dowd.
So there's a story of when Cream went in to record, I believe it was Disraeli Gears. And Tom Dowd, who was the engineer for Atlantic Records, heard that, they came in with like Marshall half stacks or Marshall full stacks. I think it was half stacks. And they turned them up in a way that, you didn't do in 1966, 67. And they recorded really, really loud, and they wanted to get the distortion and everything. And, they managed to have their way and get what they wanted to get. And that was, sort of the beginning of those days. But most of the times, the engineers and the producers would tell you can't record this loud. But Sabbath went in and they did the same thing. And they were lucky enough on their first album that they had an engineer who let them play loud and get the sound that they wanted to get. And, once they had some success after the first album, they were able to go in. And as times changed, people realized that these bands were recording loud. So they were able to, create that sort of sound in the studio. And again, by the time you get to Master of Reality, Tony's guitar sound is freaking epic. And, very uncharacteristic for 1971. All right. So another trademark of Tony's style is using clean and distorted tones to create contrast. We talked about fast and slow as dynamic contrast. He also does use clean and distorted tones to create contrast. Tony called it light and shade. Jimmy Page called it heavy and light. But it's the same dynamic principle. It's setting you up with the velvet glove and then smashing you in the face with the iron fist, basically. So a lot of the songs you'll have a clean intro like Children of the Sea or something like that, and then all of a sudden the guitars will get distorted and loud, and then he'll hit you with the riff. There's a lot of examples of that. You get Embryo and Children of the Grave, Children of the Sea, and a lot of people do this now, and it's not anything that's new or novel now. But in 1970, 1971, 1973, these things were, just starting to be used in that way, where you have like sort of a quieter intro, then a bombastic riff or verse or whatever. We talked a little bit about Tony's lead style earlier, but he's a very percussive player, and he's not one of the guys who was a pure alternate picker, really. He'll alternate pick when he needs to, but he doesn't try to pick every note. And he does use a lot of downstrokes, and he'll do some hybrid picking where he'll use his fingers and a pick and things like that. But mostly he uses his pick. He's sort of a 70s style player more than an 80s style player. Some of his trademarks include trills, where you rapidly hammer on notes and you hear like it's like an ongoing thing. And the other thing is a thing called turns, which are licks where the root note is surrounded by higher and lower notes, and you sort of do them over and over again. It's sort of like it becomes an ostinato thing where you're hearing the same 3 or 4 notes over and over again with the root note in the middle of it or something like that. He's primarily a guy who stays in the minor pentatonic and the blues scales, but you will occasionally hear some Dorian and occasionally you'll hear some Mixolydian. Given the fact that it's all gloomy and doomy music, you'd think you'd hear more harmonic minor, but it's mostly pentatonic.
That comes from their blues roots.
It comes from their blues roots, yeah.
And Ozzy is kind of a blues singer, I found.
You think?
I think so, yeah.
Ozzy's real influences, his biggest influences are the Beatles. So really? I think he's more of a pop singer. I mean, he was able to do whatever he needed to do, clearly, and he did and has done wonderful for himself. But I mean, a lot of Ozzy's music is pop music played very heavily. I mean, clearly he was their singer before they went in this direction, and he could sing blues, certainly, but I mean, I don't think of him as a blues singer the way I might think of a David Coverdale as a blues singer or a Robert Plant as a blues singer. To me, he's much more pop. So most of Tony's solos do have like a compositional feel to them that contain beginnings and endings that are worked out. The middles sometimes have an improvised feel that probably stems from some of his jazz influence. We didn't talk too much about his jazz influence, but he does like jazz a lot. I think his favorite artist is Frank Sinatra, to be honest. But not sure that you're going to hear, it's not, we tend to think of people are only listening to the music that's in the genre that they create. But I mean,
well, on the Never Say Die record, they had a jazz song, and that was one of the reasons why Ozzy didn't want to stay in the band anymore, according to the history. But when I listened to that one, I was kind of surprised to come across that sound.
Well, there's also the one there's one that Bill Ward sings that's pretty much a Beatles song. I can't remember which one it is, but I mean, it sounds like, it's a freaking Beatles song, basically, played by Black Sabbath. It sounds just like a Beatles song. And they were all huge Beatles fans, but mostly Ozzy. I mean, Ozzy
That's
has
so
said
interesting.
on many occasions that he would have never gotten out of prison if he hadn't been like a Beatles fan, and wanted to make music. I mean, it was his way out basically of abject poverty in Birmingham.
Wow. That's so funny. Did they
Yeah,
ever get to meet the Beatles or?
yeah. There was video on the Osbournes of like the day that Paul McCartney said he wanted to meet Ozzy, and Sharon comes into the room. Paul's somewhere outside, and she says, "Ozzy, you got to keep this together, but you're not going to believe this, but Paul McCartney wants to meet you." And Ozzy started shaking and was terrified. He just couldn't keep it together. And Sharon's like, "Come on, you're not going to screw this up. You're going to meet your hero, and you're going to be okay with it." And of course, he's like terrified, and when he finally meets him, he completely goes to pieces. And it's very touching and very heartwarming, really, because he's like, he's meeting the guy who meant everything to him, and it's a remarkable piece of television. But yeah, they did. And of course, Paul was a big Sabbath fan, and Paul was a big Zeppelin fan, and so he was happy to meet Ozzy and wanted to meet Ozzy and everything, but Ozzy was terrified. So we get back to Tony, and we talked about his solos being worked out and everything. And once he's recorded it, he's pretty loyal to it. And the solo that you played on the record is the solo you're going to get live. And then I guess we talk about his vibrato. He's not a guy who uses a whammy bar, really. He'll occasionally use a wider finger vibrato, but mostly because of his finger issues and the fact that his fingers were injured, you hear him mostly use sort of a fast and narrow, nervous sounding vibrato, which is probably, the best he can do, given that, he can't feel the strings the way perhaps somebody else would. He seldom bends a note beyond a whole step. That said, one of his distinctive trademarks is that he will frequently add finger bravado to power chords. And he, as we said, he does this to fill the sound out and make it bigger. So, you add all of that up, and you've got a guy who's a very distinctive player, with his own idiosyncrasies and his own sense of melodic style and approach, that this is one of the guys who is so original because of all of these things that that typically don't happen to players anymore. You don't thankfully we don't all have hand injuries that force us down certain roads and choices that and it worked out for him in a way that made him a very distinctive player, and through some very clever choices of how to get from point A to point B, over time, he found a way to carve out his own thing, and his own thing has been just this remarkable body of work. And he is, an epically big, influential player in rock, and one of the very best players of all time, and certainly one of the most original. And his like Blackmore, his influence cannot be overstated. He is another guy who's launched 1,000 other bands, from what he created with Black Sabbath, and through all of the incarnations of Black Sabbath, which we're going to talk about that in his discography.
All right, so the studio albums of Black Sabbath. Well, the first album is called Black Sabbath.
Right. And we did talk a little bit about this. I think one of the things to note about the Black Sabbath debut album is I believe it was made in under 36 hours or something like that. Both the Sabbath album and the Zeppelin album were made very quickly. And I think the Sabbath album was made even quicker. Anyone can Google this, but I mean, it was like literally they went in, they played their live set, and the set they'd been doing live, and they recorded it, and then Tony did some overdubs, and then I mean, they had so little control over their own album at that time. They had no idea what was going to be on the cover art. They certainly had no idea that there was going to be an inverted cross on the inside of the album. When you opened up the vinyl album, you know, this gatefold thing, there was an inverted cross in there, which that
it's like,
you know, immediately started the thing, that along with the title of the band and the title of the album, that they were Satanists and all that nonsense. They were actually all Christian kids who were, you know, very much God-fearing Christian kids, but they did like to sing about doomy things. But, you know, they had no control over what they were doing other than going in and playing their music in the studio. They weren't there for the mixing. They weren't asked to be involved in any of that. They had no creative control. They just went in, they banged this out in, like I said, something under 30 hours or something along the lines of that. And then it was left to the engineer to mix it, the engineer and producer to mix it. And they were out on the road when they heard that the album had charted. And they said, "Oh my God, there's another Black Sabbath out there. We have to change the name." And then like, "What do you mean? It's us? Oh my God, what do you mean it's us?" And they were absolutely in disbelief. They had changed their name from Earth because there had been another band called Earth. And they were showing up and for gigs, and people thought they were getting the other band Earth. And, you know,
and Black Sabbath shows.
You can imagine what if you're expecting something like rhythm and blues, and these four guys show up from Birmingham playing songs like Black Sabbath. People ran horrified. So that was part of the reason they changed their name. But anyway, the first album was done very quickly on a very small budget, and it's raw and it's rough and it's a marvelous album.
It's great. Yeah,
it really is. It's a great look at the band in its early days, and you can get a little bit of a sense of the raw energy of what they must have been like, really right before they got famous and broke. And this would be a good time to sort of show like the War Pigs clip from the 1970 Paris show, where Bill Ward is beating the drums like they owed him money.
A War Pigs is from Paranoid, though, right?
Right, but I mean, they just to show you the, like, you know, the early energy of them. I mean, you could pick something else from that performance, but I mean, to show how raw and powerful they were as 20-year-old kids, the way Zeppelin were raw and powerful as 20-year-old kids.
And back then, they were all still sober, right?
Well, they like their, you know, they were very poor. Everybody but Ozzy was sort of working class. Ozzy truly came from like terribly poor background. One of, I forget how many kids, but a lot of kids, and they could barely feed them. And, you know, the story goes that with Ozzy's first royalty check, he had to buy himself some shoes because he didn't have any, and he was walking around barefoot. And he bought a bottle of cologne because he hated the way he smelled.
Wow.
Yeah, he was that poor.
Yeah, people like to forget that Europe was a rough place for a long time, not that long ago.
Well, this was, you know, you're talking about not that long after World War II ends, and you have, you know, rationing in the UK for a long time, for 5 to 10 years after the war was over. They were still feeling the rebuild and the rationing and all of this stuff. And everybody over there who lived through that time, all of the people who were born at the tail end of the war, in the mid 40s, you know, they all remember this dreary black and white existence. And they said the world changed into color when they heard Elvis. And that's when, you know, when music became Elvis and rock and roll and Little Richard and Jerry Lee Lewis, they Chuck Berry. That's when all of the kids of that generation who were born in the tail end of the war years said everything changed for them, and it became about young people as opposed to, you know, your parents who had been in the war, right?
Right. If you, I mean, this is a bit of a sidebar, but if you see early footage of Elvis concerts or Beatle concerts, like people completely
Yeah.
losing their mind. Yeah.
It was a brand new thing. And, the thing that the guys in Sabbath said, it's like we came around at the same time that it was peace and love in San Francisco. And everybody was like putting flowers in their hair and they hate Ashbury. And it was all this hippie, wonderful love and stuff. And they were like, this isn't what Birmingham was like. This was not the steel mills of Birmingham, where it was, really a rough and tough area where if you didn't get out of that existence, you were going to be working in the steel mills for your whole life. And it was dreary and it was dreadful. And they went to sleep every night with the sound of the steel hammers clanking away in the factory. And, you hear this from the Priest guys who also grew up in Birmingham. And Rob Halford talks about this a lot as well. So they were not going to be making the kind of music that was coming out of San Francisco.
Right.
And that was, they were very adamant that this was not their world. This was not, they were very well aware of what was going on in Vietnam. They were very well aware of, the realities of what was going on in society beyond the peace, love, and hippie movement. And they were like, no, we're gonna show you a darker side of life. Right. And you get the very beginnings of this on the first Sabbath album with the title track, and you get it a little bit with NIB and The Wizard, and it would carry on, and these themes would recur over the subsequent albums. But the first Black Sabbath album is just, it's not their best album, but it's just an epically good album. Yeah. And it's just a wonderful breath of fresh air compared to everything else that was being released at that time.
But the title track, like Black Sabbath, it hits you like a sledgehammer,
Yeah, it really does. And then you get this classic. One of the things that also Iommi is known for is these tempo changes, where you get songs with a lot of parts. You don't get a lot of classic pop constructs of, there's some, but in some of their longer songs you get loads of different changes and transitions into other parts, that it's not just like, it's never just verse, chorus, bridge, chorus out. It's not like common pop form for most of the, you get that with things like Paranoid and stuff like that, but a lot of these songs have a lot of twists and turns in them. And then you get songs like Black Sabbath, where you have this really slow, dirgy tempo, but towards the end it kicks up and the tempo picks up, and you have what's basically like this crescendo of the whole thing picking up energy and really driving through to the end of the song. And we should really play that in the 1999 Last Supper clip, because it's wonderful there. And you get that kind of outro, and that became a hallmark of Black Sabbath, doing these tempo changes.
And then you got my favorite track on that album is probably NIB, although it's hard to pick one favorite, but that's one that I keep coming back to.
Right.
It's just
well, that's Geezer's moment, really. And he plays the big bass intro, which he would do live as well. And then it becomes this crushing riff, which is again, we're starting to leave blues structures behind and going into what would become metal. I have a friend who's a huge metal fan. He lives in Lille, France, and I was talking to him. My wife and I were having dinner with him one night, and we were talking about what makes metal different from everything else. And I said, what we was like, where does it become metal? And he says, when you start to leave the blues structures behind, and becomes more about progressions that are, less rooted in the blues and more rooted in, the minor stuff.
Interesting.
And I think it's true both with Sabbath, although there's always some bluesy stuff in Sabbath. But you get that more. You see it in Judas Priest a lot. Okay, when Judas Priest starts to really click, there's not a lot of bluesy stuff in that. It becomes much more minor bass riffs and things. And I think, they were hugely influenced by Sabbath and came out of the same exact neighborhoods. So, it's not surprising that they came up with that.
Cool. What's your personal favorite of that album? Or
it's the title track. I love, like I said, I like the whole album. And, everything's got its moment, but that first track that they wrote in this genre still stands up with every other track they ever wrote since as being as good as better than any other Sabbath song. It still is of that same caliber. It's up there with War Pigs. It's up there with Iron Man. It's up there with all of the Dio stuff. And they still, they would play it live and it would still bring down the house because it is just so effective and so creepy. And, and it got, as they changed singers throughout the years, different singers would interpret it different ways, and it would be, it would get, creepier than, in some ways than Ozzy sang it. But it has its own charm, and it has its own importance in the annals of rock history and metal history, certainly.
Right. I had the pleasure of seeing them live on the 13 tour when they came over to the Netherlands, and once they played that song, well, first of all, it's probably the loudest show I've ever been to. I distinctly remember it wasn't like loud for my ears, but it was more loud for my body.
Didn't I remember I told you at the beginning of this conversation that his sound hits you in the sternum, and it just rattles your whole skeleton. It's more than what you're right. It's not just for your ears. It rattles your whole skeleton.
Yeah.
There's something about it, the way that band sounds, that it just goes through your body. And it's just an immense sound and a great experience.
Yeah, never heard anything since or before, It's definitely.
Yeah.
But when they played that song, when it when the full bands come in, when the full band comes in, it was like, bam, like they're getting, hit by a car.
Yeah. When I saw them, I saw them on the Last Supper tour with Ozzy, which was the reunion tour when they finally got back together with Ozzy. I think it was 98, 99, something like that. And it was just magnificent. And I wasn't up close really, but you still got that effect. I saw them in the Radio City Music Hall show with Dio when they finally reunited with Dio.
Wow. And
I was 7 rows in front of Geezer Butler's bass rig. And it was like rearranging my chromosomes. It was so freaking percussive and loud and wonderful. It was just, it's like you said, it's a full body experience. And, as loud as Blackmore was with his guitar amps, and he was extremely loud, it didn't shake your body like that. It was a different kind of thing.
All right, so that's the first album, and I've also read all over the place that they got terrible reviews everywhere for the first album, even though they had their initial fans loving them, but the critics didn't really get it, and they were offended by the upside down cross and the,
Well, I don't think it was the critics that were offended by the upside down cross. That was a whole different segment of the population that had a problem with that. But yes, you could say that, and even Tony says, he said they got a little tiny bit of reasonable press, but mostly it was bad. And then from there on, it was all bad all the time. And for what it's worth, Zeppelin got the same kind of bad press, and Purple got the same kind of bad press. The guys who were in the music writer business in those days, the music press, they had no use for loud, heavy music.
Okay.
They always wanted the, they were always done in by the esoteric stuff. Right. They wanted the artsy stuff. It was all about, things like Bowie and stuff like that. And other kinds of artists. And then later on, they were all enamored with punk and all of that. They never gave a lot of love to heavy rock and heavy metal until it was long past being popular in the mainstream. later on, you have these organizations that will, induct them into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. But, these were the same people who were slagging them in 1969.
Right.
Yeah,
So I'm not sure what to think of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in general anymore. I think they also have a bunch of rappers in there now, and it's
yeah. I mean, it's all of this stuff is a music industry circle jerk. Frankly, the worst of it is the Grammys. But the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was supposed to be better than that, but it really turned out not to be better than that. And you're right. It's like there are people in there, like they got Miles Davis in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Why?
Yeah, I love Miles Davis, but his music is
not
rock and roll. Yeah.
And you couldn't call it that. You could never call it that in a million years. So I don't get it. Most people don't get it. Most rock fans complain bitterly how long it took to get a band like Deep Purple into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And, the guys in Metallica who were huge Purple fans were pounding that drum for a long-ass time. And, how long it took Rush to get in, how long it took Yes to get in. And, these are bands that had, decades worth of careers selling zillions of albums and never being recognized by the music critics and the music media and, always being, sort of short-ended with how they were viewed. So, yes, they never got any really good press. They were definitely a band, Sabbath, where they were built on their fan base. And it didn't start out well, and it got worse in terms of their press.
Right, and then their second album came out in the same year, about less than a year later, same year.
Yep.
Black Sabbath came out in February. Paranoid came out in September.
Yep, and this is arguably the crowning jewel of the Ozzy years. Although, I love all those albums, but Paranoid is the one with not only the title track being, a very well-known song that Ozzy still performs to this day, with or without Sabbath, but it's got Iron Man and it's got a bunch of other songs that frankly are better than Iron Man and Paranoid. In my opinion, Iron Man and Paranoid are probably the weakest two tracks on the album. Not that they're weak tracks, they aren't. But Paranoid was written in 10 minutes because they didn't have, they had recorded what they had and they needed one more song. And the album was due to be called War Pigs. And the cover of the album reflected, the cover art reflected the idea of War Pigs. It didn't reflect the idea of Paranoid. And what happened was they said, we need one more track. Can you go write something? And they went out into the hallway of the studio and Tony came up with the riff and they wrote Paranoid in like 10 minutes. And then they recorded it. And everybody said, oh, this should be the single. And then they said, oh, this should be the title of the album, but let's not bother changing the artwork on the cover.
It's a guy with a sword. It's
a war pig, theoretically, right? Pig being a euphemism for cops back in the 70s. In this country, they were calling the cops pigs, rightly or wrongly. And, so they had this artwork and
it's like a couple.
The album was all set to be called War Pigs, which the record company didn't like anyway. They didn't want the album to be called War Pigs. They were afraid of the backlash of that. So they said, let's call it Paranoid, and they called it Paranoid, but they didn't change the artwork. And as you can tell, the band at this point still had no creative control over their release. It was made in I think they did a slightly better studio and they took slightly longer. I think it was still done in like under 45 hours or something like that. It was still done quickly, but it was done a little bit better than Black Sabbath was done. The strength of this album is the songs and the material and the fact that they're still young and hungry and on the way up. They're not yet too heavily into drugs. Although you're starting to get into that a little bit, but this was mostly a band that was into weed and some drink. They weren't getting into heavy drugs yet. The cocaine hadn't arrived. The heroin hadn't arrived yet. All of that stuff that came somewhat later. You still got a band that's very young, very hungry, and on the way up. And you know, you talk about the tracks on this album, and you've got Beyond the title track, and
You get War Pigs, Paranoid,
you've got
Planet Caravan, Iron Man, Electric Funeral.
Electric Funeral is absolutely devastatingly heavy and wonderful.
It's so evil sounding.
Oh my God, it's such a great riff. And then, towards the end, you're getting into Fairies Wear Boots, which is also one of those ones where you have a lot of dynamic changes. It's got, right. And then
I also love the instrumental track, Red Salad, with the drum solo.
Yep. So,
just brilliant from start to finish.
It really is. And like I said, of the first albums when Ozzy was with them, this is arguably the crowning jewel of that collection. They're all good, but I mean, this is the one with the hits on it. And
Ozzy Osbourne has such a perfect voice for the music too. I mean, we talk about Tony's sound, but Ozzy's voice of this era is also just,
right. And the other thing, here's something else we want to talk about the discography and the changes of singers over the course of time. If you listen to Iron Man, for example, you're going to hear how Ozzy sings with Black Sabbath. Between Ozzy and Dio, you've got most of the Sabbath catalog, the famous part of the Sabbath catalog covered. And they're two very different kinds of singers. And if you listen to Iron Man, you hear a characteristic thing that Ozzy does, which is he sings the riff. He sings the same riff that Tony's playing. Yeah. Okay? You hear, heavy boots of lead fills his victims full. He's singing the same thing that Tony's playing.
Yeah.
And when you get to Ronnie James Dio, which we'll talk about in a little bit, Ronnie doesn't sing like that. Ronnie doesn't sing on the riff. Ronnie sings between the riffs. And Tony said this was, a sort of a difference in why the two bands sound somewhat different. And the people who, were always like, the Dio version has never been, in their minds, it's never been Black Sabbath. I think that's a little extreme. I think it still sounds like Black Sabbath to me, but it's a different Sabbath, clearly.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So from there, we go on to Master of Reality.
That's a Weed album, right?
It's funny. Here we have an album that, the first song, it opens with Sweet Leaf, which is an ode to weed, right? And, they were definitely a weed band at this time. And this is a stoner album classic. And by that, I mean, this is an album that ever since it came out, stoners have been using this album to sit around and get high and trip on this album. And it's perfect for that. It's really, sort of the soundtrack for, stoner rock, what would become stoner rock, and all these bands that would try to follow in the footsteps of Sabbath and do what they were doing. It's mostly based on this album. It's not based on freaking Technical Ecstasy. It's not based on Heaven and Hell. It's based on Master of Reality. And you get that here. And the other thing you get for a band that was considered by so many people to be satanic, there's an awful lot of religious lyrics in this album. And, if you start looking into that in songs like After Forever, you're going to see, they're talking about religious themes not as disbelievers. They're talking about religious themes as young men who were raised in the Christian faith.
Interesting.
And they're not necessarily devout, obnoxious religious fanatics or anything like that. They do question things, but they do talk about some religious themes on this album that are definitely not satanic.
Right.
They definitely are. It's definitely Christian leaning, but it's not Christian rock by any stretch of the imagination. It's just talk about some of these concepts.
Right.
And that if anybody ever looked at these lyrics on this album, they would never again call them satanic. But nobody looked.
the thing about the upside down cross, I saw in an interview with Tony Iommi that wasn't their decision, and they weren't happy about it, and they
Right.
also had witches or supposed witches show up at their concert, and they were like, "Oh wow, now we're gonna deal with this kind of stuff."
Right, and they were like, there were people who were, they had death threats. People were starting, like the religious whack jobs were showing up, and they were like going to try and kill them, and they had. You're right, they had all that to deal with, and the fact, the interesting thing is that they were really not what people thought they were in those respects. They were not, like I said, they're not people who you would think are like born again Christians wearing the religion on their sleeve, but they were all wearing crosses around their necks from very early days, not to be ironic, not to be rock and roll fashion. They wore them because they wore them. I mean, because that's how they were raised, and it's interesting. Again, you get into Master of Reality, and one of the things that, as powerful as an album as this is, the funny thing about this album, I think, is it's like, yeah, I'm looking at it right now. It's only 34 minutes and 29 seconds long.
It's not a very
at a time when most albums were 40, 45 minutes. It's only 34 minutes and 29 seconds long. It's a really short album, but man, does it pack a punch.
Yeah.
It packs an enormous punch. And so, like I said, people who are interested, they can go and they can check this album out. They can check out, the write-ups in Wikipedia and talk about, what the lyrical content was, and read what they were saying about religion, and, draw their own conclusions. But again, this is an absolute classic. And again, this is an album that launched a zillion other bands in a genre that you could either call stoner rock or doom metal or whatever, everything in between. There's a ton of bands that want to sound like Master of Reality.
It sounds so heavy. It's sludgy.
Yeah.
It's
right.
It's
and we have that clip of Tony Iommi's guitar tone, and you can say again, this is like, listen to how heavy this guitar sounds in 1971, and it sounds very much like you would hear, a modern guitar, a modern heavy metal sound or something like that.
What are some albums that came out around the same time that don't sound nearly as big and heavy as that?
Well, 1971, this is a tangent. If you Google the albums that came out in 1971, you will soon conclude, and rightfully so, that this was probably the best year in rock.
All right.
Seriously, like all of the best bands released a lot of their best music in 1971. There's a book on this too. It's called The Year the Rock Exploded or something like that. 1971.
I got it here. Like Allman Brothers at Fillmore East.
Well, let's start with Led Zeppelin 4. Who's Next? Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers.
Doors, L.A. Woman.
Yeah, not their best album, but I mean, a ton of albums that were the best albums of, and it's not just in heavy rock. It's across the board. 1971 is probably the pinnacle of rock in the year in terms of like the greatest albums that came out of that time, and it spans from like things like Black Sabbath all the way to things like Marvin Gaye and Carole King's Tapestry, and all of these albums that are absolute classics that came out in 1971.
Yeah, what an amazing time to be alive that must have been for
and
music.
The peak lasted more than 1 year, but if you look back on it, it's like, it was ramping up to this, and then it, if 71 is the peak, it's still pretty good through 73, 74, and then it starts, the quality starts going down and music starts heading in different directions. But, this year produced some of the best albums of all time from some of the greatest artists of all time. And if you want to read about that, there's a book I have reviewed on the site.
I'll put you a link in the description.
It's called Never a Dull Moment, 1971, the year that rock exploded. it's an excellent history of rock music in general, but it really does focus on like all of the groundbreaking shit that went on in 1971. It's a fascinating read if you like rock history.
Yeah, that's going to be probably my next coffee table book.
Yeah.
Cool. What are some highlights for you off that album? The whole album is great, obviously, but
Off of Master of Reality?
yeah.
Sweet Leaf, obviously. The whole thing. I mean, other than where they're doing like Embryo, where it's like sort of this, passage of, where, pass the bong. Embryo is like pass the bong, but it's all great. Sweet Leaf, Lord of this World, Children of the Grave has become a classic as well. It's a great album that ends too quickly. It's over too fast.
All right, and then we get on to Volume 4. That
originally
it was called Snowblind, but the record company didn't want them to go with that. And,
right, because Snowblind is a cocaine song, and this is where the cocaine is starting to show up and become a factor in their lives and a factor in their music. It's a great album. Volume 4 is a really good album, and they've grown musically here. This is a more complex Sabbath album than you get in the first three. They're more ambitious here. And you get things like Supernaut and Wheels of Confusion, which are, a little bit starting to be more funky almost, in there, especially Supernaut. But, Wheels of Confusion ends up with a very more, I guess it just seems like a different kind of riff than what you got earlier on. And then you get Changes, which is a piano and Ozzy song, right? It's a completely different departure for them. They're doing this song where it's just piano and vocals. And this is that Beatles influence.
It works brilliantly, right? I think.
It does. And then you have this thing called FX, that's their stoner moment where they're thinking they're doing something cute. And it's one of those things. It's just noise, basically, for 1 minute and 43. And then, Snowblind is the standout track for me.
It's a great song, yeah.
It's a really great song and a great solo, and we should probably run a clip of that live. It's fabulous. And, where Sweet Leaf was a love letter to marijuana, Snowblind is a love letter to cocaine, but even they know in the lyrical content that they probably shouldn't be doing this much cocaine. There's the part of the song at the end where it's like, don't you think you know what I'm doing? Don't tell me I'm doing too much. Basically, you're the one that's really. It's the denial thing. Where they're like making fun of their own denial about it. But this was the time when there was mountains of cocaine being done by the band, and I think they made this album in L.A.
Yeah, they rented a mansion and they basically just filled it up with. They had the legend goes that they had a punch bowl filled with cocaine.
Right.
And they wouldn't even just line up lines. They would just, dig in and.
Right. And this was I think they did it at the record plant in LA. I knew it was LA. So they'd be like, they'd be out by the pool all day, and then they go and do some work, and they do a lot of cocaine and
groupies and everything.
And at this point, it really wasn't hurting the music. But soon you would realize that it was going to be a factor.
How old were they around when they recorded this one?
Well, it's still 1972, so it's not that much further along.
Early 20s still? Like 20?
Yeah, absolutely 24? Early 20s. Yeah.
Bunch 22, 23-year-olds, it's crazy high on coke.
Right. And living that, rock star LA life as young rock stars out of Birmingham who've never seen anything like LA in the 70s. They go out there and they're like kids in a candy store, and they've got all of this stuff. But yeah, I mean, you talk about the album, you're talking about Supernaut, which is really cool and funky. And then, Wheels of Confusion is a great track. Cornucopia is heavy as hell. It's really a heavy song. And then, some poppier things like Tomorrow's Dream and Laguna Sunrise is another departure, kind of like Changes. It's just a trippy, mellower thing. And, Under the Sun at the end. And it's, another classic Sabbath album. We're still on the up here. We're still going up.
All right. And then we get Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. That comes out 1 year later, 1973. And from what I've heard, the history behind that one, they wanted to do the recording again in Los Angeles, but they couldn't get they couldn't get inspiration at that point. So they locked themselves in a dungeon of a castle somewhere in England. And, they were all constantly freaked out in there because they thought they saw ghosts and everything, and that brought the inspiration back. So the legend goes.
Yeah, I think I've heard some similar stuff. I think they were young, impressionable, and high off their gourds. So I think it was not so hard for them to get that sort of feeling. But musically, you start out with the title track, which is another one of the great Iommi riffs, especially the one. I mean, the main riff is a great riff. The riff at the end is just, for me, it's even better. But my God, it's a different sound. You put on Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and his guitar sound is such a different sound now from what you had on the previous 4 albums. You're getting, they sound like Norelco Razors in some ways. He was experimenting with his tone and getting a very different sound here. And as good as it is, it's a different sound. And then, we have some poppier moments like Killing Yourself to Live. National Acrobat is a classic. Sabracadabra is a classic. I believe this is also the album where you have, I think Rick Wakeman guested on this album. Let me check that out.
You are correct. He was brought in as a session player, and he played on Sabracadabra.
Yeah. Right. Rick Wakeman is one of rock and roll's greatest and funniest characters, and one of the most badass musicians who ever lived. But he is an hilarious man, and he got along famously with those guys. And in those days, Rick Wakeman could drink anyone under the table, including those guys. And they brought him in, and he played some keys for them on that, and became lifelong friends with Tony and those guys. And you're thinking, this is the same man who plays all this classical stuff on the Yes albums. And you're thinking, on the Sabbath album? Yes, well, this is what happened. So,
what a cool time to be alive, man. That must have been.
Yeah, especially if you're a young rock star in LA with the world at your feet. So I think, of the Ozzy albums, this is for me where it's starting to get a little bit spottier. It's a good album. I like the first 4 better, and I like Sabotage better than this, oddly enough. But this is considered one of the great Sabbath albums too. It's not that it's a bad album. It's just you're starting to see some experimentation here that I don't think is working so much. Like Who Are You? Not the Who song, Who Are You? It's a completely different song. But Looking for Today, those things to me are sort of like Sabbath dipping in their toe into some different areas and trying to experiment. And, some of it works and some of it works less, in my opinion. But, you still have a lot of goodness here.
Standout tracks for you?
I love A National Acrobat. I love Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. I don't think Ozzy's ever sang that high since. At the end of Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, if they ever did it in concert, he didn't sing that stuff past the, when the tempo changes towards the end. On the studio album, he sings some really high stuff that I don't think he's really capable of past those days.
All right. And then we get Sabotage, which is, I agree, I like that one better than Sabbath Bloody Sabbath.
I think it's less experimental. I think it's more back to their sort of like their comfort zone, if you will, right?
Yeah.
And it starts off
fantastic.
Yeah, with the epic "Hole in the Sky." My God, it's just a huge riff. It's a wonderful song, and you're in for it. And then, "Symptom of the Universe" is another popular one.
I really like that one.
Yeah, it's heavy, but it's poppy, and different and weird.
It starts with like a very heavy riff, and then it changed into a funky acoustic kind of.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's again, they're branching out more here. You're hearing more attempts at different things and different musicianship than you heard in the first 3-4 albums. And like I said, some of it works great, some of it doesn't work so great. They have more money, they have more control, they have more time in the studio to experiment. They're not making now they've gone from making albums in 30 hours to making albums that take forever because they've got too much time and too many drugs on their hands. And, so it's a classic story, but I mean, these albums took longer and longer to make. And then you get Megalomania, which is an epic track, another really heavy epic track. And, this is to me, this is the last great album with Ozzy.
Okay.
And I think most people would sort of agree with that.
They were still, like in terms of drugs, they were still heavy on the cocaine. And you also mentioned heroin earlier.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I know, they wrote about heroin and everything. So I don't know who was using the heroin and when. A lot of guys in that era got turned on to heroin because when you've done mountains and mountains of cocaine, you need to come down because you'll stay awake and you'll keep yakking and yakking away and talking and chattering away because you're all wired up on cocaine. And one of the things that would bring you back down so that you could sleep was heroin. So a lot of these rock stars who were doing a lot of cocaine, they would get into heroin as a way of coming off cocaine. Yeah. So think about that world. And,
Yeah. I know.
And by the way, we should also mention the cocaine in this era was not the stuff that we think of these days, whether you've done it or not in recent years or even in the 80s. The cocaine of the 70s, the early 70s, was pharmaceutical grade cocaine by companies like Merck, by pharmaceutical companies. This was not stuff that was done by like Colombian drug cartels and stuff like that. This was done by like major drug companies. They would put out pharmaceutical grade cocaine that doctors could prescribe somehow or get a hold of somehow. So, it was a completely different experience than, what would come later with people cutting cocaine with bad things and, things that would be, much more harmful. It was pure and it was a completely different experience. I'm not condoning it. I'm just saying these guys were doing a cocaine that most people have never done.
And will never do.
And will never do. Exactly. So, I mean...
like I said earlier, it was a crazy time to be alive.
Yes, it was.
I bet.
Yeah.
Yeah, I find here on the internet that Ozzy indulged in that heroin, which doesn't surprise me at all.
I think Bill did too. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me if all of them did for a little while, but I mean, we're reaching the crescendo with the Ozzy era here.
The next one is Technical Ecstasy, with the
right
in 1976 with the weird cover. Two robots.
Well, it's a hypnosis. It's a hypnosis cover. So these are the same guys who have done like a zillion other covers, like Dark Side of the Moon and Houses of the Holy and all the UFO albums.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Hypnosis. They were doing. They do great cover art, and they did this one as well. So
cool. Okay.
So this album, I don't know a lot of people who love this album. the song "Dirty Women" is pretty good. It's got a nice riff. It's got a great riff. But the rest of this album, you know, to me, if I when you ask me if I'm not looking at it, what's on Technical Ecstasy beyond Dirty Women, I can't remember a thing. And that ought to tell you everything.
It's Alright is an interesting one with Bill Ward on vocals. Almost sounds like a Beatles song.
Yeah, that's the one it's basically a Beatles song. Yeah. And, you know, like I said, they were all heavily into the Beatles, but I mean, there's not a lot on this album that's going to really compare with the earlier stuff. This is where it really starts to go off the rails, particularly with Ozzy. Ozzy is, at this point, using drugs at a more copious rate than the rest of the band. He's further into his dependencies and addictions than the rest of the band. And, you know, even Tony will say, you know, it's like, not that we were much better, but he was worse than we were at that time.
Backstreet Kids is also decent, I think.
Okay, I'll take your word for it. I haven't heard Technical Ecstasy in a long time.
But my favorite is Dirty Women, for sure.
Yeah, Dirty Women is a good one.
And then we got, let's see, Never Say Die. That's a good cover with the Pilots.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if that was also Hypnosis. It might have been. I can't remember. But whether it was or whether it wasn't, this is another one of those ones where, I mean, I remember Junior's Eyes. I remember Johnny Blade a little bit, but I never listened to these albums. These last two, they just never occur to me to play these albums.
It has a jazz track on it, and the story goes that Ozzy, when they were in the studio and they played it for Ozzy to sing on it, he just walked out. He refused, and then it became an instrumental track.
Which one's that?
It's Breakout.
Oh, okay. So here we have what's basically the end of the Ozzy era with Black Sabbath, and their stories are throughout the entire. You can see endless clips of everybody describing this time in Sabbath's career, whether it's Tony describing it or Ozzy describing it, and they were all off their gourds on drugs, and Ozzy was worse than all of them, and he wasn't working, he wasn't showing up. You know, they had him replaced for a minute and a half, and but then they got him back, and after this album was done, they ended up having to fire him, and they sent Bill Ward to do that because one of the things Tony's never known for is doing his own dirty work, but this was where they split with Ozzy after this album.
It's also when I look at the date from 1970 to 1976, they put out one album a year, at least. But there were 2 years between Technical Ecstasy and Never Say Die. So
yeah, so they had a lot of other distractions in those days in the late 70s. So they fire Ozzy. And in one of music's most serendipitous happenings that has gone on, at the same time Ozzy is leaving Black Sabbath, Ronnie James Dio is leaving Rainbow. And, you know, this is one of those happy moments in music history for all of us who love heavy rock and heavy metal, because going from where they were with the last two albums, particularly in Black Sabbath, to finding Ronnie James Dio and him essentially righting the ship. You know, the ship has been like sailing off course and listing away and sinking slowly under, you know, this massive drug use and losing their direction in their path and, you know, not being able to figure out where to go anymore. They managed to hook up with Ronnie James Dio, and they come, you know, they invite him down for a jam. His music, obviously, his work with Rainbow was well known to everybody at that time, and how good a singer he was well known to everybody at that time. And he goes down and he jams with the members of Sabbath, And I think the first thing they write is Children of the Sea. And it comes together like the first day they get together. Because I guess Tony had the part, but Ronnie comes in and starts singing. And had, he came up with, Ronnie was never a big drug user. Ronnie was always on his game. Ronnie didn't, have problems with his voice or his attitude in that respect. He was always a consummate pro. He came in and all of a sudden, this is what's coming out. This kind of music is coming out. And while it's a little different, and we talked about, the idea that how Dio sings not on the riffs where Ozzy would sing on the riffs, it is a subtle change in the sound of Black Sabbath. But my God, I mean, this is like exactly what they needed. And even though Bill Ward doesn't remember recording much of this album these days because he was so far out of it, this album, Heaven and Hell, the first album of Black Sabbath with Ronnie James Dio on vocals, is one of the best metal albums of all time, and is generally in the conversation of the best metal albums of all time. There is not a dud track on this album. And if you think about, we've been talking about the other albums with Ozzy and how like they were getting spottier and spottier from volume 4 on, right? There's only 8 songs, but every song on this album is absolutely fucking bulletproof and immensely good. And Ronnie came in and breathed new life into this band and inspired them musically. And the results are just spectacular. It's a different Sabbath, and people have always argued about, which Sabbath they like better. I love them both for different reasons. To be honest, I was in my early years more exposed to the Dio Sabbath and got into the Ozzy Sabbath later because I was coming into the right age at this time. And most of the classic Sabbath albums, I was a little too young at that time. I certainly grew to appreciate them later, but this was much more current for me. This was happening at a time when I was, getting into my mid to late teens. And, this album, sparked another era for the band of, really coming back very powerfully and very, very strong. And, it turns out the split was great for both Ozzy and for Black Sabbath. Ozzy goes on after floundering for a few months. Sharon Osbourne rescues him from his own, nasty habits, gets him cleaned up and gets him a solo career deal, and he finds Randy Rhoads. And you have both of these. You have Heaven and Hell and Blizzard of Oz coming out in the same year, right? Yeah. And it's like, what do we got here? We got an album from the remaining members of Sabbath and an album from Ozzy, both of which are better albums than anything Sabbath had come up with in the prior 5 years, right? Blizzard of Oz is tremendous. Heaven and Hell is tremendous. But together, this band had run out of things to do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
You have a situation where the split, as painful as it was at the time, turned out for the best for both sides. And, aside from the title track, which is an absolute classic on this album, everything on this album, like I said, there's not a bad track on this album. Everything on this album is absolutely stellar. If you want to know what heavy metal is about and what it should be about, and what it should sound like, and what it sounds like at its best, put on Heaven and Hell. It's in, like I said, it's in the conversation of the best metal albums of all time. This is just as good as it gets. And, we have some clips of Ronnie Dio with Sabbath, and we'll play some of it, but it's just a tremendous rebound. It's kind of like, you have a couple of instances in rock history where, Bon Scott with AC/DC, he dies, and they get Brian Johnson, and they come back with Back in Black, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't happen all the time.
No. No, it's
You know?
usually over when the lead singer.
It's usually over when you lose your lead singer like that.
Especially when he's
Yeah.
amazing, you know?
Right. And, whether you want, whichever camp you're in on the Van Halen thing, you've got to admit that when the change took place at the singer level, the band basically reached new levels. Whether you liked it or you didn't, with Sammy Hagar on the vocals, it was clearly a commercial success for the band when they changed singers.
And a different sound, too.
And a different sound, yes. And it always comes with a different sound. Almost always. But you have now Ronnie James Dio with his powerful voice. It's not like Ozzy's voice. It's this mighty sound.
I don't know anyone who sings like that.
Yeah, I mean, and Ronnie came in with this completely different vocal aesthetic and this mighty sound, and it took Tony's riffs and songs to a different place that they could not have gone with Ozzy. And there's a lot to like for both eras, but this was the start of something, a new direction. And
well, let's we start off with Neon Night.
Mm-hmm. This is an up-tempo rocker, very straightforward, nothing particularly complicated here, and it's just a good opening track with a high energy sort of tempo. Mm-hmm. When you get to Lady Evil, it's like you have this galloping bass line that starts the thing off, and it's this geezer thing, and it's got sort of a great funky push-pull to it, sort of a mid-tempo track.
We also got Children of the Sea between those two.
Children of the Sea is, I'm looking at it in a different way. So Children of the Sea is, like I said, the first song they wrote together. This is sort of like almost a pop construct, but this is where you have that sort of thing where they do the gentle opening and then the riff comes in and just flattens you.
Yeah.
And you get to hear Ronnie's voice where he's like, we talk about the great Ronnie James Dio albums of all time, and people talk about Stargazer on Rainbow Rising. Generally speaking, Ronnie James Dio's most popular albums that he's ever been associated with were Rainbow Rising and Heaven and Hell. And there's a couple of them that I would say are their equals, but I mean, he just took this stuff to a different level with his voice. And, he for all of Ozzy's greatness and his own character, from a musical only perspective, Ronnie just has a much more flexible voice and a much more dynamic voice and a much more powerful voice as an instrument. Just if you're classifying it as like, this instrument can do this, right? The human voice is an instrument, right? And you have guys who can sing like Jeff Tate and Ian Gillan who have like 5-octave ranges and stuff like that. And Ronnie has this character of his voice that he can change on a dime. He can sing. He started off as a doo-wop singer in the 50s. He can sing anything, really. He could sing the phone book, it would sound good. But he became known as this powerhouse metal vocalist, probably the most prototypical metal vocalist of because his voice, its natural quality had so much power and control and character that he is still on the Rushmore of metal vocalists of all time. I mean, and as good as, if not better than anyone else would be on that Rushmore with him. And
there's just weight behind it too. It's it's what I would think about like a perfect metal voice, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a really apt sort of description. As much as I love the Bruce Dickinsons and the Rob Halfords, who have their own same level of stature, but Ronnie's right there with them, and Ronnie in some ways is so emblematic of metal. He's just he's the guy who invented, the devil horns with your hands. He's the guy who popularized that in metal. He has this great storytelling voice, whether he's talking about Stargazer or something like that, or Heaven and Hell, where they'd stretch out Heaven and Hell live. They'd play Heaven and Hell live, and it was a Ronnie James Dio moment on stage, whether he was doing it with Sabbath or when he was doing it later with Dio. And he would go into this whole thing where he would just mesmerize the audience in a way that I would hesitate to say Ozzy does not do. Ozzy's sort of this lumbering guy on stage who's walking back and forth. He has his own character. He has his own charisma, but he's not got that same captivating persona.
He won't leave you in awe when you...
No, he'll leave you laughing.
Right.
And Ronnie James Dio won't ever leave you laughing. There's footage of Ozzy Osbourne with Sabbath in that reunion tour where he comes on stage in front of Tony Iommi and he's making faces at him and trying to get him to laugh, and he pours a bucket of water over his own head and stuff, and Tony's trying to play and he's cracking up. That's not Dio. Dio remained in character on stage. Dio was not a clown, right, in the way that Ozzy could be a clown. And just a completely different thing that he brought to the table. And I love both guys, I really do, but I mean, Dio is is a guy I miss so much since his death. I just miss him terribly, and everything he brought to this genre of music.
Yeah, I was seriously bummed when that news came out.
Yeah.
All right,
so anyway, like I said, there's no bad tracks on this album. Die Young is another epic moment. Lonely is the Word. He's singing his ass off on Lonely is the Word. Wishing Well is another up-tempo one that's really fun. Every part of this thing is bulletproof. It's 8 bulletproof songs, and you really can't knock it.
And then 1 year later, we get Mob Rules with a very dark, creepy cover.
So the thing with Mob Rules is, as good as Heaven and Hell is, Mob Rules is pretty much just as good, without maybe as many songs that are as iconic. Or maybe they are. I may be speaking out of my butt. I don't know. It's comparable to Heaven and Hell. I think if this had come out first, maybe this one would be the more iconic album. But track for track, you get just as strong an album as Heaven and Hell. Turn Up the Night is this album's Neon Nights. It's very similar. It's the up-tempo fast track that's, it's just straightforward. It doesn't have a whole hell of a lot, beat to, beyond that. It's a good track, like Neon Nights is a good track. Voodoo's got a great riff. It's more of a mid-tempo thing. And then you have this epic Sign of the Southern Cross, which is basically kind of the Heaven and Hell of this album. It's got the long plotting, drawn out thing where, for 7 to 8 minutes long, it's this slow tempo thing, but it's just heavy as hell.
Great vocals, great riffs, great guitar solo. It's just...
Yep.
It has everything.
It has everything. And then you go through this little noisy interlude called E5150. I don't know where they got that title. It was as long before Van Halen. But that's sort of an intro. It's not really a song. It's just sort of an intro to the song The Mob Rules. And The Mob Rules is another great up-tempo track that's just really, really good. And then you have, Country Girl Slipping Away, Falling Off the Edge of the World over and over. Again, all of these songs are terrific. And maybe just a little less iconic than their counterparts on Heaven and Hell. But they're like two sides of the same coin. And you end up with like Over and Over, which is, again, Ronnie James Dio singing his ass off in this operatic sort of way that's just really wearing his heart on his sleeve and singing very emotionally and very powerfully. These songs, this album, and Heaven and Hell are just like absolute standouts. They are terrific.
So, yeah, in other words, if you loved Heaven and Hell, also listen to Mob Rules for sure.
Absolutely.
Just, epic. I personally really like Voodoo and The Sign of the Southern Cross. Those are my two personal favorites from that album.
Yep.
All right, and then 2 years later, we get Born Again with a very creepy cover with a baby with fangs and nails.
Yep.
And there we got Ian Gillan from Deep Purple on vocals.
And this is one of my favorite Sabbath albums of all time. And it's a very polarizing album. People either love this album to death like I do, or they don't like it. And what had happened was Ronnie James Dio had a falling out with the band. They had a live album. They were, at odds with each other. You can Google why. There's a bunch of stories about, they weren't working together really. They were like, Tony and Geezer would go in one time a day and Ronnie would come in the other time a day. And there was like accusations that each one of them was fucking with the mix and stuff. So they had a falling out. And then around this time, Ian Gillan's own solo band, after having left Deep Purple, was sort of petering out, and he wasn't doing very well with his solo band. And Tony and Ian knew each other, so they went down to a pub, got absolutely shit-faced together, and the next morning, apparently Ian Gillan woke up and found that he had agreed to be in Black Sabbath. And Ian's manager called him and said, next time you do something, could you let me know you're going to join Black Sabbath? And Ian was like, what do you mean? No, apparently last night you joined Black Sabbath. So it was a different sort of start to this kind of thing.
Well, it's the best way to really get to know someone, in my opinion.
Yeah, but they just, they had a great time, and they were drinking buddies for a long time. And the thing with this album that it's just a very extreme album in that, everything about this is kind of extreme with his vocals. So if you're a Deep Purple fan and you've never heard this album, imagine every track being like the parts in Child in Time where he's shrieking.
That's a good description, yeah.
And his vocals on this album are absolutely astonishing. It is some of the most extreme singing you will ever hear. His voice is probably at its pinnacle, and he never sang like this again, really, other than in moments. But on every track of this album, Ian Gillan is pushing his voice into places that human voices, you don't usually hear them go. And to an absolutely astonishingly weird and wonderful effect. Add to that, you say the evil cover. The whole album's vibe is incredibly evil.
It is.
And creepy. It's really, really disturbingly creepy as an album.
Is. Yeah, especially the third track, Disturbing the Priest.
Oh my God, yeah.
Unsettling song.
Yeah, and we'll play some of that. The whole album, all right, so it starts off with Trashed, and this ought to tell you, like, the mindset of the band. This is like, they went out in the countryside to record this album at Richard Branson of Virgin Atlantic, Richard Branson, Virgin Airlines. He had a mansion that he was renting out to bands to use as a recording studio. In those days, you would, they'd build a recording studio in a place, or they'd bring like a mobile unit, like the Rolling Stones mobile unit, and they'd record an album in a house like that, like Headley Grange, where Zeppelin recorded Zeppelin 4 and a lot of Houses of the Holy and Physical Graffiti. And they all sat around, and this place, in addition to being a mansion, he had like a go-kart racetrack on the premises, and they all got shit-faced one night, and they're driving around, they're driving around this racetrack in real cars, I believe. absolutely drunk off their gourds. And Ian Gillan, I think he flipped his car over. He was lucky to be alive. He was driving this course, and this is this song about how he was driving this course absolutely drunk off his mind, and flipped the car and managed to walk away unscathed.
Back then, cars weren't very safe, you know.
Yeah, and you know, it's a go-kart track. It wasn't meant to be like, you know, driven around in Bentleys and stuff, you know. So that was that track. And then in the tradition of having a creepy introduction to a song like we had with E5150 on the prior album, they have this track called Stonehenge. And Stonehenge became a thing, and that's where that sort of became on their tour of this album. That's sort of where the beginnings of the Stonehenge that morphed into the Spinal Tap Stonehenge happened.
Yes.
But then they go into Disturbing the Priest, which is possibly the most evil sounding song, certainly of the Sabbath catalog, but some of the most evil music you'll ever hear. And some of the most ridiculous vocals you will ever hear anyone ever sing.
Yes.
And this is, you know, the stories that come out of this album, you can find the stories. Ian Gillan recounts a lot of them online on YouTube and things like that. But it you know, you hear the story and it's really like, you know, we were playing so loud the vicar came over from the local parish and said, "Could you please turn down?" That's not what you get when you hear Disturbing the Priest, the song. That's not. It's like that's where it came from, the idea, right? But when you hear this sound, it's not like that. I mean, it's Disturbing the Priest sounds like this evil demonic thing that we're so evil we're disturbing priests. And the other thing that I always thought was like when they would do the tours live and you had like the song Black Sabbath, which we've talked about a lot. When Ozzy sang it, it sounded like, you know, "Oh my God, please God help me." And he was like, you know, sort of, he had this way of delivering those lines where it was like, this dark force is chasing me.
Yes.
Right. And when you hear Dio sing the same thing, it's kind of like the dark force is about to get you. Right. Because he's singing it with a different character than Ozzy sang it, you know? And he becomes sort of this more demonic side of things, whereas Ozzy is still sort of like, you know, the guy who's running away. Dio is kind of like the guy who is like chasing you. And Ian Gillan, when he was singing things like Black Sabbath, he sounded like the devil incarnate had caught you and he's now torturing you and is taking delight in like torturing you. And you hear that in like Disturbing the Priest. It's like, I've caught you. I am now roasting you over a spit, and I am laughing at you because I've caught you, and you are now my demonic plaything. And this album has a really creepy vibe to it. And when they toured this thing, I remember a friend of mine went and saw the tour, and he said, I was 2 songs in, I had to leave. He said, the hairs on my arm were standing up. It was just too off-putting, too weird, too creepy. And I thought it was like, you know, I couldn't handle it. It was that kind of vibe in the building, you know, when they were touring it. So, I mean, I don't know how many people had that, but I've heard more than one person say, this was a really creepy version of Sabbath. And it just didn't, there's no fun here.
No.
This is all really serious. This is all really creepy. And, you know, you get songs like Disturbing the Priest, but then you have, like, again, another interlude into Zero the Hero. And Zero the Hero is another one of these grindy riff things. And it's just relentless.
Like
Yeah. And it's just one of these relentless Tony riffs. And by the way, they put out a couple of videos for these albums because this was 83 and MTV was happening. And the Zero the Hero video is creepy as fuck. It's like you look at this, and I think they meant it to be sort of like funny tongue in cheek, But it didn't come across that way. It came across really, really weird and bizarre. And the trashed video, too, was sort of like, not as creepy as Zero the Hero, but the videos for these songs were just dark and really disturbing. The imagery that they used was disturbing. And some of it was a little, you can look back on it now, many decades later, and say it was a little comical. But in the day and in the era of the videos that were coming out, like this is the videos that are coming out at the same time as like the ZZ Top Eliminator videos.
Hot chicks and hot rods and stuff.
Right, and then you see like the video for Zero the Hero where it's like guys in a mental institution doing experiments on people, and it's just like really weird, dark stuff. But musically, this album is just absolutely amazing, and people hate the mix. People think the mix is muddy and all of that stuff, including guys like Ian Gillan, and they've talked about in recent months even, they've been remastering and remixing the Sabbath catalog. And they've all said, we would love to remix and remaster Born Again, but the tapes are lost. No one knows where the tapes are. They can't lay their hands on them.
Oh, wow.
But for me, the mix on this, it never bothered me at all. I mean, it's not the best mix you'll ever hear in your life, and it's not the best production you'll ever hear in your life. There are things that are produced much better. But for me, the music is so strong on this album that it doesn't matter. Geezer Butler's bass lines on things like Disturbing the Priest are just nasty as can be, and the riffs are great. But Ian Gillan just steals the show with his vocal performance. Every song he's singing at full capacity and pushing his lungs to a place where you wouldn't think they could go. And you get that on Digital Bitch, which is sort of an up-tempo song. It's a little less creepy. It's a little bit more like a normal lyrical content song. But then you get into Born Again. And Born Again, the title track, is a slow, sort of plodding, epic thing where, again, Ian Gillan just takes this to a place that you can't believe vocally. He goes up and hits notes that are just, like, sick, absolutely sick. And it's a really powerful tune that's one of the slow Sabbath songs that just is really unlike anything you've heard in the catalog before, and mostly because of Ian Gillan. And then you have Hotline and Keep It Warm, which are more traditional tracks and in some ways a little less evil, but great riffs, great bass lines, and just ridiculous vocals all the way through. It's like every song is the high parts of Child in Time. And if you want to hear one of the great rock metal vocal performances of all time, it's this album. This is one of them. He's doing stuff that Ronnie Dio couldn't do, and Ozzy could only dream of in his nightmares. It's a really bizarre mix of this voice that Ian Gillan has with this vibe that Sabbath could create. And it only lasted one album.
But it kind of surprised me because, Deep Purple isn't evil sounding music at all to me.
Right. And Ian Gillan was not that kind of guy either.
Yeah.
They wanted him to dress in black. He wouldn't do it. He'd go on stage in red jeans and in like a biker vest and stuff. He just would not fit in with their evil stuff, and he wouldn't do it. But what he says to this day is, like, he said, the music we create, he said the mix is terrible. He couldn't believe how bad the mix was. But he said, the original music that he heard coming out of the monitors before it got mastered and all of that, he said it was really good stuff. And, I think everybody would be pleased if they found those tapes and redid them. But even if you don't, I mean, I've heard this music now for a long time. And this is, like I said, one of my very favorite Sabbath albums, but I'm probably in the minority. A lot of people find it too creepy and the vibe too weird. And for me, it's just musical excellence. It's just, you're hearing performances of, everybody in this band at the top of their game. doing something that's really striking and really different from what came before it. But still, it's still grounded in Tony's riffs and, you know, good songs and all of these things. It's just extremely extreme sonically. And I think it's too much for some people.
Yeah, you can't put it on in the background, and you cannot put it on
No.
when other people are around who are not ready for it, you know?
Right. And if heaven help you if you're having a bad trip or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
Or if you're, you know, if you're not in a sober state of mind, or if you're susceptible to, you know, freaking out or something like that, this album can freak you out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure. All right. The next album comes 3 years later, and it's called Seventh Star, and it was supposed to be a Tony Iommi solo project, but the label insisted on putting it out under Black Sabbath. And I listened to this a couple times, and I really like it, actually.
Yeah, there's a lot of people who really like this album, and for what it's worth, I'm a huge Glenn Hughes fan. Glenn Hughes is the singer on this album. Glenn Hughes from Deep Purple Mark III and 4. Glenn Hughes has a magnificent voice, but Glenn Hughes at this particular moment in history was coked out of his mind and was having vocal problems. You don't hear them so much on this album, but it manifests itself on the tour. So anyway, you're right. This was supposed to be a Tony Iommi solo album because the only person left in Sabbath at this point is Tony Iommi. Geezer Butler's gone. Bill Ward is long gone.
Where have they gone? Have they just kind of quit the band, and was it because of drug
Well,
problems?
Bill Ward has had health problems ever since like the end of the Ozzy era. Like I said, and he was heavily into drugs. He doesn't remember recording Heaven and Hell. He wasn't on Mob Rules. That was Vinny Appice. I think he did play on Born Again. I can't recall if he played on all of it, but by the time they toured, he was not with them. He was replaced by Bev Bevan, and
he was on the drums in Born Again. Yeah,
he was not.
He was.
He was. Yeah, that's what I thought. But he didn't tour with them. He was not in good enough health to be touring, and so by the time you get to Seventh Star, Tony thinks this is a solo album because he's the only one left. There's no one left in Sabbath, but you know, and the record company said, no, you know, if we put it out under the name Black Sabbath, people will buy it more. And the thing was, Glenn Hughes, who was a good friend of Tony's, agreed to be a singer on Tony's solo album. He never thought he was joining Black Sabbath. And he was another guy who was shocked to find out he had joined Black Sabbath. In you know, only record companies can do this kind of stuff. So anyway, this album, you get there's some really good lead work on this album by Tony. His lead playing on this album is really some of his better stuff. If not maybe some of his most memorable stuff, it's really quite good. But song for song, it's good. I don't think it's anything as near as good as Born Again, personally. I don't think it's anywhere near as good as the two DL albums before Born Again. But it's a good album, and you have yet another amazing singer joining this band.
Yeah, I was constantly amazed by the vocals, too, on this one.
Right. Glenn Hughes is a guy who is one of the best singers on the planet to this day. But at this time, he was doing a lot of coke and a lot of booze, and it was affecting his voice. And he also had a problem. I guess he was in those days, he could be very obnoxious and rub people the wrong way. And someone belted him in the nose, and he got hit in the nose, and he was bleeding down the back of his throat. And the blood dried on his vocal cords and crisped up his vocal cords, and he was having trouble singing. And he had, at one point, I believe he had to go have his vocal cords scraped by an ENT. And so you don't hear that on the album, but that's what kind of happened on the tour that supported this album. And for the most part, as good as this album is, they reunited later and did much better music on 2 albums in the 90s. Well, one was in the 90s and one was in 2005. And Glenn Hughes was clean and sober in those days and singing way better. Glenn Hughes is a freak of nature as a vocalist, too. He's another one of those guys. He was in the Cal Jam video wearing the white suit on bass, right? And he's singing his ass off even then. He was a better singer at age 43 than he was, and at 53 than he was at 23. He just kept getting better and better, and he's one of those guys who has a voice. He's now the lead singer in the Dead Daisies with Doug Aldrich. And this man has one of the best voices on the planet. And this is not his best work, this album.
That's pretty amazing because it's amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing. I mean, he's a guy who has sang with every great Dino player that you can possibly think of to name. He sang with Gary Moore. He sang with John Norum. He sang with Blackmore. He sang with Iommi. I wished he'd sung with Page, but he hasn't. But I mean, he's done an awful lot of work over the years, and he still remains sort of a cult figure. He doesn't have the stature, the mainstream stature of the other guys, but he has not lost his voice at all. And he's like, he's pushing 70, or if he may have turned 70 or something like that. And he's on the Dead Daisies album from this year, and he's fantastic. And he's a great bass player. And, him with Doug Aldrich is a fucking win. I mean, it's just, it's really good. And he's more of a funk soul guy. He was the guy who was pulling Deep Purple in the direction that Blackmore didn't want. But he's been, like I said, he knows everybody. He's been in the industry forever, so he's been friends with Tony forever. And this was the first time they worked together. And it's a good album. I'm not saying it's not a good album, but it's not Born Again, and it's not Heaven and Hell, and it's not Mob Rules. It's not that level of good.
Sure. Yeah, no, I definitely agree with that. What are your favorite tracks on that album?
The single was No Stranger to Love.
I don't like that one that much, personally.
Yeah, that was the single. Seventh Star is kind of like that same kind of idea of the droning hypnotic riff along the lines of like Zero the Hero. It's not as good. I like In for the Kill, the first track. It's got good energy and a really good solo. But Heart Like a Wheel, I guess it's that one and the one that it runs into.
I really like Danger Zone too. It has that like 80s vibe to it.
Yeah, this is like what, 87, this album? Something like that? 86. 86, yeah. But like I said, I mean, you don't even have, Glenn Hughes is a great bass player, but he's not even the bass player on this album. He's just the singer. And you have Tony on guitar, and I think you had Dave Spitz on bass, and I can't even remember who else was on, but nobody who had any affiliation with Sabbath. This should have been called a Tony Iommi solo album, but it wasn't. So a lot of people don't think this is much of a Sabbath album in that respect.
But in terms of Tony Iommi guitar work, it's definitely a good one too, right?
Yeah, and like I said, I think his lead work on this album is excellent. Really, sort of like at a technical proficiency level where he's really shining very well on this album that way. And not that, like I said, he always does, but it's just, every time he surprises you with with his lead work, it's kind of like, oh yeah, he's a great lead player too, right? I forgot, because it's like you're grooving on these riffs, and it's like, he'll just, he'll take Zero the Hero and he'll hammer you with the same riff for 7 minutes, and it's like, it's relentless and it's terrific, but it's like, that's what he's known for. And that's what, really sells it. But it's then he'll go and rip, really good solos like on this album. And, you forget, oh yeah, he's a really great lead player too.
Right, and then we move on to the Eternal Idol, where we have another personnel change.
Yep. And here's where I'm going to, be honest and say, this is where I'm starting to get off the Sabbath train for a little while. I had the Eternal Idol album, and I liked the song The Shining, and I liked some of this album, like the title track and the first song and the last song. But the truth is, in between, I'm not remembering so much of it, if I'm honest. And this was, I guess, the first album where you had the new singer.
Yeah, Tony Martin.
Yeah, Tony Martin has a great voice. And there's a lot of people, including Tony Iommi, who really like the Tony Martin era of Black Sabbath. And eventually they got Cozy Powell on drums. But again, this is a band where Geezer's not in this band, I don't think. So again, from the standpoint of, is this Sabbath? It's Sabbath in the fact that this is what the record company calls this. And, your mileage may vary. So you've got Bob Daisley, who's a great bass player. You've got Eric Singer, who's a great drummer. Later on, they'd be in Gary Moore's band, the both of them. And you've got Dave Spitz on some of the bass, and then Tony Martin on lead vocals. To me, this is not a Sabbath lineup. This is, a Tony Iommi thing, where he's playing with a bunch of other good players. So
it's good. I listened to this in preparation for this podcast, and I quite liked it. It has quite an 80s vibe to it, but I agree that it doesn't sound like, it doesn't have the same like energy as the other Sabbath albums, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And the album that came after that, Headless Cross, with also Tony Martin on vocals, I like better than that one. It has Cozy Powell from Rainbow on drums, and it's
This one is, I think, considered the best of the Tony Martin era.
It's really good.
Yeah. I haven't given this one enough plays to speak, confidently about it, to be honest. I've heard it. I didn't rush back to it. I don't really have a whole lot I can say confidently about this album. This is one of those things where you're going to have to try it for yourself and see if it speaks to you.
Well, one interesting track is When Death Calls, because it has Brian May from Queen playing the guitar solo on that song, and it's really cool.
Right. Brian May and Tony Iommi are extremely close friends. One of the things that most people don't know about Tony Iommi is that when Freddie Mercury died and Queen did their Freddie Mercury tribute concert at Wembley Stadium, and they had all of those great people coming up on stage singing songs, and you had Robert Plant singing Crazy Little Thing Called Love, and you had Roger Daltrey singing what he sang, and you had George Michael singing Somebody to Love. All day long, however long this was like a multi-hour concert. I can't remember how long it went, but it was like many, many hours. Off to the side of the stage, very rarely seen, Tony Iommi was playing rhythm guitar that whole day and letting Brian, be out front and doing most of his guitar parts. But Tony was playing that whole day. You see him on the video in the background, and he's basically fattening up the sound that day and, being there for his buddy and, playing all these Queen songs and playing rhythm guitar for them and, helping everything sound bigger.
That's really cool. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Well, of that album, my personal favorites are Headless Cross, When Death Calls, that's the track with Brian May, and the last one with, that's called, second to last one, that's called Nightwing. That's a song I really like. So that's definitely one to check out too. It's great drums, great vocals, great guitar.
Sure.
Let's see, and then we get Tyr.
Yep.
Which is based on Norse mythology, which led many to call it a concept album, but they insist that it isn't.
Right. So this one, I think, is not thought of quite as highly as Headless Cross. Again, this is not what I listen to very much when I want my Iommi fix. These last albums, as some people love them. Some people, like me, just feel that they're just they're there. it's not something that I would, gravitate towards listening to. Doesn't mean it's bad, doesn't mean anything like that. But of the three albums of that era, I think this one was, I don't know if they, the high point was considered Headless Cross, and this one was not. So I don't know if people like this one better than Eternal Idol, but fortunately, all was about to change for the better in 1992 when they reunited with Ronnie James Dio for an album called Dehumanizer.
Another intense cover.
Yeah. So, ever since Dio had left Black Sabbath, he started his own band called Dio and had great success there on his own with the original lineup of that band, with Vivian Campbell and those guys. And they put out two absolutely classic albums that are, like I said, classic metal landmark albums in Holy Diver and Last in Line. And then the lineup started to change and Vivian Campbell left and it wasn't the same band and things weren't going quite as well. But he still had a great following for that band. But in 1992, it was decided that they would reunite Ronnie James Dio with Black Sabbath. And not just, the Black Sabbath with Cozy Powell and nobody else from Black Sabbath. This was like, we're going to get Geezer back, we're going to get Vinny back. And so it's the same lineup that's on Mob Rules. And once again, these guys get together and they deliver the goods. And this album is fantastic. And, in many ways, it's every bit as good as the other two. It's a little different because you're now, 10 years later and the music world and landscape has changed a bit and your lyrical content is a little different and the vibe is a little different, but the music, it's like going home again. It's just, these songs are really great songs again. And you have, tracks like Computer God, which is, certainly indicative of the era where computers are now starting to be in everybody's home and everybody's workplace. He's talking about that. Then you have After All, which is a really slow plodding Sabbath dirgy song, which is fantastic. And that's another great Dio performance. And then, it goes on and you get just one great track after another track. And Ronnie's in unmistakable stamp on this album vocally again, not just lyrically, but, vocally. And things like I, which is a really powerful song. And then Buried Alive, which is kind of like Zero the Hero redone as a Dio song with really great lyrics about being buried alive. It's a terrific album, and it's amazing that these guys, when they got back together, 10 years later almost, the magic was still there.
They've only put out great ones with Dio.
Yeah.
What are your personal favorites of this one?
This is another one where there's nothing that's really bad on this album. There's no bad tracks on this album. It's really just like, I think After All, The Dead is a great track in the heavy Sabbath vein. TV Crimes is an up-tempo one, and then you've got some ones that are sort of mid-tempo ones, and then you have something like Too Late, which is similar to like the way they would end the last two albums, like the way they ended with like Lonely Is the Word and Over. It's Ronnie doing almost a Sabbath ballad, right? And then I and Buried Alive. Buried Alive is badass, man. It's just it's in some ways it's more melodically interesting than Zero the Hero, and it's every bit as relentless. It's a better song, really. I mean, what makes Zero the Hero is the tension, but Buried Alive is in my opinion a somewhat better song in a similar sort of style. where you have this relentless riff that doesn't change much throughout the song, and you just take that riff on a ride and you go with it. But again, there's nothing on this album that isn't good.
It's a heavy album.
Yeah, it is. And it's funny because when I saw them in Radio City doing this stuff, it wasn't this tour. I didn't see this tour. I saw them later on when they reunited and they called it Heaven and Hell. But they started the concert with After All, which is a really odd choice because it's a slow song. And it was just like, you'd think, you're going to start off with something up-tempo and high energy. And this is a really sort of like a slow song, but it's a great song. Unfortunately, they kind of botched it live, but they sort of recovered later. But I mean, if you watch the Radio City performance, they kind of screw up a little on After All when they open it. And I think, like I said, it would have been a better choice somewhere later in the set.
Well, and that album worked out great, but then Dio left again. Yep.
And they went back to Tony Martin, and they got Rainbow drummer Bobby Rondinelli, but Geezer stayed, and it's another Tony Martin era album called Cross Purposes. To me, this is just like the others. There's nothing on this that stands out to me. And like I said, to be honest, I haven't listened to it a ton because it just never really spoke to me that much. So you'll have to decide for yourself whether you're into this era of Sabbath. And they did another one called Forbidden in 1995.
They tried to venture into the rap metal stuff a little bit.
Right.
And they had Ice-T rapping on Black Sabbath riffs, which was kind of interesting.
Yeah, I mean, they were always willing. I mean, Tony was always willing to try some stuff, especially considering this era was kind of him calling all the shots anyway. And, like I said, I wasn't so much into this era of the band, but in 1996, he decides to make an album again with Glenn Hughes. And once again, this was supposed to be a Tony Iommi solo album. And they recorded a bunch of things, and it ended up being called the Depth Sessions. And what happened was, long before it was put out as the Depth Sessions, there was a bootleg. And I had the bootleg, and some people I knew had the bootleg. And it was like an album's worth of material written by him and Glenn. And it's kind of the two of them together is a really interesting mix, because Glenn Hughes, for all of his pipes and his vocal prowess, is a soul singer. He's not a blues singer, and he's not a metal singer. Now, he can shriek with the best of them, and he can do Highway Star and all of that stuff. He can sing anything you ever care to sing. But at his heart, he is like, his vocal style comes from the Stevie Wonder school. He's not like, it worked wonderfully with when you were blending it with David Coverdale. But, I mean, he's a soul singer more than a rock singer or a metal singer. And he brings the funk. So you had this album that they put out together called the Depth Sessions, and they put it out eventually because everybody seemed to have copies of the bootleg, and they finally decided to put it out. Let me look it up while we're talking about it.
It's kind of an interesting way to put out an album.
Yeah, so it was a bootleg. It was called Eighth Star because the last one had been called Seventh Star. So someone had the bright idea to call it Eighth Star. And so they put this out, and it's a really interesting album in that the two of them blend very well. And for most people who work with Glenn Hughes, if you're not a good songwriter, or if you're not a strong songwriter, if you're just an average guy, Glenn Hughes tends to bowl you over because he's a good songwriter. And he's a bass player. He mostly writes on bass, and he writes a lot of funk bass stuff that's like where the riff is like bass riffs rather than guitar riffs. And it's an interesting sort of place that he comes from. And you wouldn't think that he's going to like mate particularly musically well with the father of heavy metal and riffs, right? But for whatever reason, when they get together, it's very interesting music. And they did this album, and it got shelved. It never saw the light of day when they originally recorded it. And I think they originally recorded it. I don't know when they originally recorded it, but
96.
Yeah, it looks like it was 96, but it didn't come out in 96 unless you had the bootleg.
Yeah, it came out in 2004, and then they recorded the drums. What was the reason why they didn't put it out?
I think, again, it was supposed to be a Tony Iommi solo album, and then it didn't happen as a solo album, and I don't think Glenn Hughes wanted to get roped into doing Sabbath again, and I think he had that happen. And the reason they redid the drums seriously was because the original drum tracks were performed by Dave Holland, who had been the Judas Priest drummer, and he got convicted of I guess they called it attempted rape several years later, but it was with young boys, and they didn't want any association with Dave Holland, so they took the original tracks and they brought in I guess it was Jimmy Copley, I guess they brought in, and Don Airey on keyboards, and Jeff Nichols occasionally on keyboards, and like I said, this is an interesting album. It's, in my opinion, it's 8 songs. It's better, in my opinion, than the stuff they came up with on Seventh Star. But these two would reunite again in 2005 and come up with really a fantastic album. But Glenn Hughes brings a very powerful voice with him, but he also brings some soul that you're not really used to hearing when you hear Iommi. You know? It's definitely a different... It's, for a lack of term, it's less white. It's really just, he brings some soul to this that even guys like Dio have plenty of soul in his voice. Dio's not a soul singer.
He's definitely a unique singer in this rock landscape in terms of style.
Yeah, and it's funny. He's another guy who's sort of a polarizing figure because you either love his voice or you don't. And
what's not to like about it?
People who only have experience with like singers that come from the blues side may not like it. If you don't like R&B and soul and things that are like Stevie Wonder kinds of vocals. If you don't like that in heavy rock and metal, it can be off-putting.
Right.
And there are times where it works, and there are times where it doesn't work quite as well. But oddly enough, when he works with Tony balances him out in a way that like lesser players don't. When he worked with Blackmore, he was great. When he worked with Iommi, he was great. When he works with good songwriters, he's great. And when he works with guys who are just average guys, it tends to be the Glenn Hughes band. Whether you like it or not, he becomes the primary songwriting vehicle of those bands. Mm-hmm. This is what we talked about with Joe Bonamassa when he was doing Black Country Communion with Joe Bonamassa. Joe Bonamassa can't write rock riffs. So this band, Black Country Communion, it's basically Glenn Hughes driving the songwriting and Joe Bonamassa playing lead over it. So fast forward, and now he's working with Doug Aldrich. Doug's a better songwriter. Doug can hold his own with Glenn Hughes. And it doesn't sound like a Glenn Hughes album. And I say this as someone who owns a lot of Glenn Hughes albums and likes them, but it's like when you hear him with guys who are not particularly strong songwriters, they tend to get bowled over.
Right.
It's like, imagine yourself, I mean, this is an extreme example, but imagine yourself working with Paul McCartney and you're not a good songwriter. What's the music going to sound like? It's going to sound like Paul McCartney, right?
Yeah.
Now, if Tony Iommi works with Paul McCartney, it's going to balance it out, right?
Yeah, it's going to have something of both.
Tony's not getting lost by Paul McCartney.
No.
And Tony Iommi isn't getting lost with Glenn Hughes. So, that's what happens when Glenn works with people who are of his stature or better. He tends to get balanced out, and you get the best of what he brings without him taking over, really.
Okay. Favorite songs of that album?
Gone is really good. It's funny. There's a song on the new Dead Daisies album that rips off the riff in Gone. Yeah, it's funny, and it's just like, I guess Glenn thought, he was enough a part of that he could recycle the riff. And a lot of people have recycled riffs before, including Ritchie Blackmore. So From Another World is really good. Don't You Tell Me is good. I'm Not the Same Man is good. This is all good stuff. It's all really good, and it's not Sabbath. It's Iommi and Glenn Hughes. It's a completely different vibe. It has nothing like the dark vibe of Sabbath, and it certainly has nothing of the dark vibe of like Born Again.
Right.
It's got a different vibe. Glenn Hughes isn't going to give you that darkness and that evil vibe. He doesn't write songs like Ronnie Dio writes about, like, Dungeons and Dragons and stuff like that. And he writes about human condition things. And so it's a completely different vibe, but it's still Iommi giving you the riffs. These heavy, crushing riffs, and you're still getting a brilliant vocalist who's also a really good bass player. And so it's got a little bit of funkiness to it, but not in a way that you would, necessarily, feel as a departure.
Okay.
It's not funkadelic. Let's put it that way.
And then a year later, we get one more album with also Glenn Hughes called Fused.
Yeah, and this is where I'm not sure quite why this wasn't bigger than it was. This is the culmination of everything great about Glenn Hughes and Tony Iommi together, and everything on this album is phenomenal. And if you haven't heard this album and you like heavy and you like great singing and you like Iommi riffs, you really need to check this album out. Start with every song on this album is balls out great. But if you listen to a song like Wasted Again, you're getting Glenn Hughes singing his ass off in a close to that Ian Gillan sort of register, right? It's really that epically good vocally. And everything on this album is really, really good. This album should have been way bigger than it was, and I think the reason it wasn't, they never toured it, and I don't think it ever got released as a single or much radio play. This is a almost 50-minute long album, and it's just phenomenal. It's really, every time I go back to it, I'm reminded about how good it is. And it's stellar from everybody's perspective. The writing is great. Glenn's vocals are great. The riffs are great. The supporting cast is great. You got, on this one, you've got Kenny Aronoff, who's a killer drummer, and Glenn's playing bass, which is always a good thing. And it's a completely different look for what you get with Iommi. Now, the one thing we didn't talk about, and we out of sequence here, is there was a Tony Iommi solo album in 2000. They finally let him make an album called Iommi, the record company. All right? And this was what the Depth Sessions was supposed to be.
Okay.
His album between Seventh Star and the Depth Sessions, Tony's been trying to put out a solo album since 1987, and he finally gets one out in 2000, I guess, and it was recorded between 1996 and 2000. Like I said, originally this was going to be the Iommi solo album was going to be the Depth Sessions. At least that's the way I remember it. Wikipedia may have a different perspective on it, but back in the day when I was following this stuff as someone who was an avid fan, it was like Tony Iommi was going to put out a solo album with Glenn Hughes. And then we hear nothing, and then it never happens. And then we get the bootleg Eighth Star, which was the tracks from eventually the Depth Sessions. And all of a sudden, later on, it was like, oh, Iommi's solo album's coming out. And the record company said, we'll let you do a solo album, but you've got to use all of the modern musicians of the day instead of the guys you would, instead of having Glenn Hughes and your normal cast of characters, right? You're getting... Pretty
amazing that even at this point in his career, he still couldn't,
tell the record company to fuck themselves? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to me, this is a really good album. But if Tony had been able to make this, so here are the people who are the vocalists on this album: Henry Rollins, Skin, Dave Grohl, Phil Anselmo, Serge Tankian, Billy Corgan, Ian Astbury, Peter Steele, Ozzy, and Billy Idol. Okay, these are the vocalists on this album. And this is, like I said, between the late 90s and 2000. Now imagine if Tony had been able to make a solo album with, say, Bruce Dickinson, Jeff Tate, Ronnie Dio, Ozzy, Rob Halford, all of the great metal singers. If he had been able to do that, I think it would have been an interesting thing as well. But I mean, the choices here are obviously driven by who was popular in that time frame. And I'm not saying Tony didn't like these guys; he probably did. But it's a very different album in that every track is different.
The singers are all over the place.
Yep, and the common denominator is Tony. And it still works, and the songs are really good, and the production is terrific, and every one of these guys was dying to do a track with Tony Iommi, especially like Henry Rollins. Henry Rollins is like one of the biggest Sabbath fans of all time. You see him on all these videos when they talk about all the great metal bands and stuff. Every time they talk about Sabbath, they cut to Henry Rollins because he is like the biggest Sabbath fan on the planet. So all of these guys wanted to work with him. Dave Grohl, who is the biggest fanboy of all time, right? But, you have a lot of people on this album who were, big names at that time. And it was sort of, to me, it looked like something that a record company would have organized.
Yeah. They did something similar with Slash a couple of years later, where he made an album with a whole bunch of different singers on each track.
Right. So, I mean, having said that, and having been sort of initially disappointed that this wasn't the kind of vocalists that I wanted to hear on an Iommi solo album, I will say this is a really good album, and it stands up. And there's some interesting things on here, and some fun things on here.
Brian May's on there too. Yep.
You don't really notice him very much, but he's on there. And so you've got Matt Cameron on drums on some of the tracks. Bill Ward played on the track with Ozzy. That's like going home. It's funny. It's like there's a song called Who's Fooling Who, and it's like as soon as Ozzy chirps in with his voice on this thing, it's like all of a sudden you're home. It sounds like, I mean, you've got Bill Ward and you've got Ozzy. I don't know where Geezer was that day, but that sounds like, a Sabbath track. And everything else sounds like Tony with other guys, but it's really pretty good. And some really interesting kinds of takes on stuff. But to me, at that point in history, I wanted to hear the Glenn Hughes album with Tony Iommi, and I got this instead. And so I still like it. I still think these are good songs. It's still Tony being Tony, and all of the hallmarks of Tony's playing are all over this thing. It's a good resume for him in some respects. If you want to hear all of his guitar style and all of his guitar techniques, it's all over this because everybody did a different kind of track with him. But it's a really good album.
What are some standout tracks for you on this one?
The riff on Meat is fantastic. I reviewed this album on my website too, as a sort of an exercise in like doing what I called a music appreciation review.
Yeah, link in description.
I mean, the Henry Rollins track is really good and up-tempo, but he's not very melodic. There's this incredible riff on this track by this chick Skin called Meat. Goodbye Lament is kind of like, it's very Nirvana-ish. It's with Dave Grohl, but it's very Nirvana-ish. Time Is Mine is Phil Anselmo, is very Pantera-ish. Black Oblivion has Billy Corgan, and that's one of those songs that takes a shitload of twists and turns. Billy Corgan wanted to be on one of those songs that had a load of time signature changes and stuff in it like that. One of the best songs is Just Say No to Love with Peter Steele, who was on vocals. And he has this really deep, dark voice, and it's really creepy. And then you have the Ozzy track, which I said, like, it sounds like you're going home. And then you have this one with Billy Idol on it called Into the Night, which is a lot of fun. And vocally, it's hilarious. But
Billy Idol is a guilty pleasure of mine, man.
I don't have anything bad to say about Billy Idol, but it was an interesting choice having him. But this is an interesting album. I like this album better than anything I heard of the Tony Martin era.
Then the last or second to last part would be Heaven and Hell, the band.
Right. So.
And they put out one album called.
They put out one album, but prior to that album, they put out 2 songs. They put out 3 songs with Ronnie Dio when they got back together again. And 2 of the 3 songs, other people disagree, but in my opinion, 2 of the 3 songs that they did prior to the release of the album, and they didn't make it on the album, they were just sort of like, they did these as like, they were putting out a Dio era Sabbath album compilation. And they had 3 tracks on it, 2 of which are 2 of the best songs I think they ever did together. And that's a big statement, but people don't always agree with me on this. But I think the songs are called Shadow of the Wind and The Devil Cried. And those 2 songs, to me, your mileage may vary, are as good as anything Sabbath ever did with Dio. They're epically big, colossally good riffs with amazing vocal performances. And they're just spectacular. And the other one was more of an up-tempo type of track called Ear in the Wall, which was kind of more of like a Neon Nights kind of thing. It wasn't the epic. It was more of like, just an up-tempo rocker. But The Devil Cried and Shadow of the Wind is like of that Sign of the Southern Cross type of ilk. And it's just really, really good. And they did that, and then everyone had their hopes up for this album that was coming out. And they decided at that point, Ozzy and Sharon had wrestled the name Black Sabbath back from Tony. Tony had owned it for a while. And then I guess somehow Ozzy and Sharon managed to either buy it back or get it back somehow. And they decided they would call the band with Dio Heaven and Hell. And they got back together, and this was an epic event in metal. I went to see the concert, like I said, in Radio City in 2007, I think it was. I was sitting 2 rows ahead of Eddie Trunk. And everybody who was anybody in metal was at that show, because we'd all been waiting since 92 to see these guys back together. And they didn't disappoint. It was terrific. And like I said, the Radio City show was filmed, but it was just wonderful to hear them back together playing again. And Ronnie sounded great. What we didn't know at the time, sadly, was that Ronnie was starting to feel the symptoms of stomach cancer. They did put out their album, the Heaven and Hell album, and I wanted so badly to like it, but I just didn't think it stood up. I knew a couple of people who liked it, for me, it just didn't work, and it was nowhere near as good as those 2 tracks that I mentioned.
I did like it.
Okay.
I didn't like it as much as the initial 2 albums from the 80s.
Right.
But Bible Black stands out for me.
Yeah, Bible Black is kind of like a knockoff version of the 2 songs I just mentioned. When you hear those 2 songs and you compare it to anything on The Devil You Know, you will soon realize that nothing on that album stands up like those 2 tracks.
What's the reason you think they didn't include them?
They'd already used them on the compilation.
Right.
The bigger question is, why wasn't the album better? Not why were those tracks so good? Why were these tracks not as good? Right? That was what I wanted to know. I was like, because everybody was so waiting in anticipation of that album, and for a lot of people, it landed with a thud. If you'd never heard Heaven and Hell, and you'd never heard Mob Rules, and you'd never heard Dehumanizer or anything else they ever done, you might really like this album. But if you heard those other albums, this just did not compare.
No, I definitely agree with that.
And the tease was, I mean, the real setup was 2 of these other tracks that they put out were as good a quality as you would expect. It was exactly what you expected on The Devil Cried and Shadow of the Wind. Those 2 were everything you wanted it to be and more. And then when the album came out, finally, it was just like, there's nothing even close to those 2 tracks on that album. And I think, sadly, it was probably because Ronnie was sick and probably not able to, work in the capacity that he would have preferred, During that time, he started having to go get cancer treatments.
That's some serious stuff to go through.
Oh my God, it was absolutely tragic. And he lived in LA, and he was flying every weekend to Houston to the Anderson Cancer Center, which is the best cancer center in the United States. And it was just heartbreaking. He was like, he never gave up. He was fighting till the day he died. And it was just heartbreakingly tragic. And he was going back and forth on a weekly basis getting these treatments. And we all know what those treatments do to people and what they take out of you.
Oh, yeah.
And it's amazing that he got through any of it. He got through the tour, and he got through, making that album, and his voice was still his voice. He didn't, it's not like his voice suffered in that respect, but everything else may have suffered. I don't know. I don't know why that album wasn't better than it was. But so this is just me speculating that I think, the situation had a toll.
Yeah, I'd say that's probably a good reason and a valid reason too.
Yeah, right.
And by the way, what's interesting is that those 3 tracks you mentioned, they are on the Japanese version of the album.
Okay.
They're the 3 last tracks of the album.
Yeah, they were. I think they were originally on a compilation that came out here called Black Sabbath: The Dio Years or something like that. And I was so encouraged that those songs were that good that I thought the album was going to kill, and it just didn't. And
okay,
so
standout songs of the albums are not on the album. The Devil Cried, Shadow of the Wind.
Those were my standouts. And I remember Bible Black, but Bible Black to me is a knockoff of the others.
All right, and then we're getting, well, let's see, we skipped a live album that came out in the late 90s, or we mentioned
we can talk about, there are live albums along the way, right? But I think the Ozzy one is Live at Last. I don't think anyone thought that was a particularly great album, but it was all you had for a while. I think that was one of those ones that was kind of rushed out by the label or something like that. But no one counts that among the world's great live albums. But there's a better live album with the Ozzy years. That's it's called
Reunion, right?
Well, yeah, but I mean, there's one called Past Lives, which I believe is the Sabotage tour, which is pretty good.
1970 to 75 recorded.
Yeah. So Past Lives is a really good live album of them in their glory era. The reunion album is fantastic. They were, as you said, the sonics are way better. The band is mature. They're on their game. They're all happy to be back together. It was a phenomenal album and a phenomenal video, and we've played you some clips from that video. And then in the Dio years, you have Live Evil, which was the album that came out after Mob Rules, and that's the album where they started to sort of like get at each other's throats. And but it's a really good album. It's kind of like the best of Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules live.
And then they also have Cross Purposes live. That's from the Tony Martin era.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's, let's see, live at Hammersmith 2007, live Gathered in Their Masses 2013, and then the last one is The End live in Birmingham 2017.
Yeah, and that's towards the end where they wouldn't give Bill Ward a decent contract, and they used Ozzy's drummer, I guess, for the 13 album and the tour, and nobody on the planet thought that that should have happened that way, and that was coming out of Ozzy and Sharon's camp, and Tony should have frankly told them to go fuck themselves, and that's not Tony. Tony never does that. So Bill Ward isn't in the last Sabbath album, which he could have easily been. But they tried to sort of like stiff him and underpay him, and he wasn't going to get like the same money other people were going to get.
After all those years,
After all those years and all the money that all of these guys have made, and as much money as Ozzy and Sharon have, come on. Like, this is going to be the last time. And by the way, the other thing we haven't mentioned is that Tony now has cancer. And Tony's been fighting cancer since shortly after Dio died, I think. And he doesn't want to do any more touring, really. He might want to do some more recording. It's unclear what he's going to do. But the point was they knew this was going to be Sabbath's last hurrah, and they couldn't find a way to pay Bill Ward. Come on. That's just being awful. And, I expect awful from Ozzy and Sharon's camp because Sharon's terrible. But this is where Tony and Geezer should have stood up and said, fuck that shit. If you don't pay him, we're not doing it. Right. Give him an equal piece. And they didn't do it. So I found that sort of sackless, and a lot of people found that sackless. And so it was what it was. And then I heard the album, and it wasn't because of Bill Ward, but I just didn't think 13 had anything on it that was that memorable either.
Yeah, that's the very last album, the last studio album, so let's also close on that one.
Yep.
Bill Ward's not on there. They got the drummer from Rage Against the Machine, which is kind of a strange choice.
He was a great drummer, but it should have been Bill Ward, and everybody knows it. So you got a question, like, with everybody's got as much money as they've got at this point, particularly the Ozzy people, why would you want to go out as a dick?
Yeah, that's really the lingering question.
Yeah, why go out? It's like, why go out screwing your guy when you know this is going to be the closing of the circle, the full circle, right? We come back to this. I've got cancer. I'm not going to play anymore. I want to play with Black Sabbath one more time, and I'm not going to stand up for Bill Ward. Shame on you, Tony. Shame on you. And Geezer. Shame on you both. And I'm not alone in that. I think everybody felt that way, and everybody thought this was a deplorable way to do that. So it is what it is. People are what they are. Tony, if you read any of the Sabbath novels or any of that stuff, any of the people who've written bios and stuff like that, everybody says Tony's a great guy, but he never comes off as having the strongest backbone in the world. And I'll leave it there. But as a guitar player, as a songwriter, as a icon, as a riff writer, he is unparalleled. He is right up there with Blackmore and Page as the most important guy of all time in heavy music, frankly. You don't have this genre without him. Or it would have looked different, let's put it that way.
All right, I think those are good closing words, unless there's something else you want to throw in there or end on.
Nope, I think that'll do fine.
All right, everybody, that was another good one, eh? Man, it was a long one, but it was great. Just like the last time, I have learned a lot about rock music and Tony Iommi in particular, and Black Sabbath, of course, and all the other amazing bands that the man was in. So be sure to go to dinosaurrockguitar.com to find the text version of this deep dive into this legendary guitar player and many other legendary guitar players. You can find a wealth of information there on rock music, heavy rock guitar, or Dinosaur Rock Guitar, I should say. The Dinosaur Rock Guitar. That's what this is all about. So go there, dinosaurrockguitar.com, to find profiles on all the greatest rock guitar players of all time. Go to diederik.blog to find show notes on this podcast and every other podcast I've done. You will also find links to the sponsors of the show. And if you're watching this on YouTube, first of all, thank you, because I just started this and you were one of the first members on here. And the channel is growing slowly but surely, and I'm thankful for that. So if you're here on that medium, be sure to subscribe and press the bell so you get a notification every time a new episode comes out. And that's all I got for you today. Dave, again, my sincere thanks for coming on. It was another great experience to talk to you about this, and I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everyone who's listening too. And dear listener, thank you for listening as well, and I'll see you in the next one. Good seeing you.